Chapter 301 Despair and Helplessness. Jake remained flabbergasted for a long time after witnessing such a brutal killing. He was certain that these images haunting his mind would remain forever etched in his memory. Despite his apparent trauma, his brain was in a state of turmoil. Numerous scenarios and explanations that could explain what had just happened were running through his mind nonstop, one by one, quickly sifting through his logic. Soon he regained his composure and narrowed down the range of plausible explanations to two major hypotheses. Either the second ordeal was proceeding as planned and everything that had happened had been anticipated by the Oracle, or an incident defying the Oracle system's prediction capabilities had occurred, as in his first ordeal with the digester's appearance. In his heart, he prayed that the first assumption would be the right one, or it would end in disaster for these prisoners and himself if he did not find a way to escape. Fortunately, the current situation tended more towards this hypothesis, or else it would mean that the Zorians were even more terrifying than the digesters. After all, as soon as Jake had discovered the digester's presence with his own eyes, the Oracle had immediately repatriated them in an emergency. The fact that nothing happened here was therefore rather reassuring. He was willing to believe that he had been extremely unlucky on his first ordeal to stumble upon an invasion of digesters, but he refused to think that such an anomaly could happen a second time. Otherwise, the testimonies of the other evolvers, and probably the Oracle system, would have warned them one way or another. What had really shaken Jake was that these aliens could actually see their bracelets and extract the alloy out of them. During his first ordeal, he had been free to hide or show his bracelet, but the native Myrmidians and Thrasgenians had been unable to discern the true nature of the bracelets on their wrists. The ability to hide the bracelet was only to protect themselves from other participants. Whether Jake hid or showed his bracelet, only the nearby players had shown a reaction back then. The natives had always ignored this magic trick. He had the feeling here too that these Zorians couldn't see their bracelet directly, but they were very clearly aware of their existence, and the altar forged from a giant red soul stone seemed to be able to solidify these bracelets in plain sight. If the Oracle system had really foreseen this scenario, and considering that the risk was increasing for the surviving players when their rewards should have increased, then there was no doubt that the punishment for having their bracelet stolen from them could not be too severe. Alas, Jake had no doubt that it would still have severe consequences, which he hoped would be offset by a better rating. Now that he knew what would happen if he was captured, he knew that it was better to commit suicide, even if it would mean losing some of his precious ether stat points. Since these sanctuary bubbles were located on an abandoned asteroid of System A0, it was quite consistent that the residents of this world were once part of the mirror universe, and therefore there were players among the Zorians when this system was still inhabited. Given the unprecedented levels of ether and gravity that Jake had measured on the asteroid, it was clear that the Zorian or Zorians who had built these sanctuaries for their descendants were at the top of the mirror universe food chain. Even if they were not, they were still considerably superior to the evolvers of B842. Trying to guess or infer what kind of deal or relationship they had with the Oracle was completely futile. Maybe they were players themselves facing dangers for the mirror universe that he wasn't even aware of. Although the second hypothesis was less likely, it was much more frightening. Based on his own experience with a brain eater, he knew that the Oracle system was not invincible. He had to consider the possibility of dying permanently on this island. Thinking about this eventuality, the terrified face of Noemi and the alien dissected on the altar flashed before him, and he felt like something was gripping his chest, momentarily preventing him from breathing. He didn't know this cousin of his very well, but seeing the exhausted and desperate expressions of Sarah, Kevin, and Kate among the prisoners, his heart tightened slightly. Maybe he appreciated them more than he thought he did. Still, he knew it would not change the facts. If Jake knew how to save them, he would have tried something. Even if the success rate was not 100%, he could accept to take a measured risk. But escaping from such an alien army, where even the minions were already a tough match for him, was just plain dumb. It would be admirable enough if he managed to cross the distance separating him from the prisoners without alerting a guard. If he did, he would then have to remove their chains and probably wear them or protect them in person because of their weakened state. Even if he managed to free everyone to create chaos, he had no doubt that the priest and his giant servants would be able to regain control of the situation in a matter of seconds. Then he would not even be able to escape. While Jake was lost in thought, the altar had been cleansed of his blood by spilling large buckets of water. The priest Zorian was not satisfied and had already signaled the guards to bring in the next prisoner. Seconds later, a young woman with sky-blue hair was dragged to his feet. At a glance, Jake recognized a noble Aegean from the same planet as Enya and Essia. With her long wavy hair, her electric blue irises where one could get lost, and her voluptuous, though slimmed-down body, her pitiful appearance and the dry tears along her cheeks should have easily evoked a reaction of lust or compassion in a male human. Unfortunately, the priest Zorian was as inexpressive as a rock. With the exception of his creepy smile, this alien had not once changed his expression. "Please, I have done nothing to deserve this." She started sobbing as she brought out her best acting. With her current despair, it wasn't too difficult. The expression on the priest's face remained indifferent. Instead, his head tilted slightly to one side with a contemplative look of false puzzlement. The creepy smile was still there. "Oraclean, the accent is horrible, but I guess it's good enough for second-class player to have started learning the language. Your internal structure and meridians indicate that you come from a world where some form of magic is possible. But right now, both your core and meridians are empty. No matter what your status or talent was in your home world, it's useless here. Well, you can die now." The eyes of the tetanized woman bulged when the priest Zorian announced the sentence, but her face was now more filled with confusion than fear. Jake, who had heard everything, was no exception. Second-class player probably referred to the number of ordeals a player had participated in. It was incredible that this alien had such information. He seemed to know more about the mirror universe than the participants themselves. However, the young woman again didn't have time to dwell on this. Once thrown on the altar, the young woman's body ignited under the effect of this purified red soul energy like the previous alien. Instead of mutating into a giant and hideous monster, the air began to crackle around her, and soon lightning snakes as wide as her forearm flashed around her body, quickly engulfing the young woman in an ocean of lightning. Thunder cannon. Barely lucid, she aimed both palms of her hands at the priest, and an Aegean version of Kamehameha engulfed the Zorian preacher with a deafening thunderclap. The explosion of light was so dazzling that everyone watching lost their sight for a few seconds, including Jake. When he opened his eyes again, his eyeballs nearly popped out of his head. The fuck is that? And who's dumb enough to yell out the name of their technique? Did she think she was in an anime? Jake couldn't believe that such a naive and stupid person could exist at this stage of the second ordeal. Like the two pink-haired sisters, she probably had a pampered childhood that stripped her of her common sense. Of course, that wasn't why Jake was so shocked. When he regained his eyesight, he had found that nothing had changed. The altar was intact, as was the temple behind the priest. As for the priest himself, he had not moved, but in front of him the foot of the skyscraper-sized humanoid monster had intercepted the lightning strike. For this creature, such a voltage was no better than static electricity. Its skin was still charred on the surface, but for a monster of this size it was nothing at all. Also, less than a minute later the charred skin had peeled off, replaced by a brand new skin. The prisoner had totally lost her mind, and a new giant lightning bolt was charging between her palms, promising to be even more devastating. But as she was about to fire a second shot, the lightning around her magically dissipated. Jake realized that much like he and Luyan a day earlier, this firepower came at a price. In a matter of seconds, her beautiful appearance had been reduced to that of a mummy breathing its last breath. A little more, and she would have disintegrated on the spot, like a sand castle after a passing wave. Sigh. A few minutes later, she was dead like the previous prisoner, and her organs had been harvested in other containers. The alloy in her bracelet had also been absorbed, sinking under the altar through the grooves like the first time. Then the slaughter resumed, over and over again. Chapter 302, Fighting a Zorian. For the next few hours, Jake grew dull at all these executions. The Zorian priest had no intention of stopping, and the crowd seemed to gorge themselves on these barbaric acts like geeks binge-watching their favorite TV series. The day passed, and the number of participants still in the running continued to drop at a dizzying rate. However, The prisoner's sacrifices taking place right in front of him were not enough to explain such a hecatomb alone. The other Zorian tribes were probably doing the same thing. Even after several hours, only about 50 prisoners had been sacrificed, and luckily Sarah and the others were not among them. In contrast, more than 100 players had been eliminated during those few hours. Including the prisoners, they numbered just under 900. When night fell, which Jake could only know from the time indicated by his bracelet, the sacrifices came to an end. As placidly as he had come, the Zorian priest walked back quietly toward the temple and disappeared inside. Once far from the red crystal soul energy, the Zorian had reverted to his appearance of a graceful middle-aged man, although his cruel grin made him seem rather nightmarish to the prisoners and his own people. Jake kept a close eye on him until he disappeared inside the temple, and with his keen eyesight he noticed a crucial detail. Even the Zorians were not immune to the negative effects of flinchium. The priest seemed to be able to control the output of energy consumed, but not perfectly. The Zorian's robust physique had thinned considerably, and his skin was dry and moderately cracked. Right now, he was at his weakest. Could this be a trap? Was the Zorian faking his weakness? Jake could not be certain. Too bad. I'd better find a way to get away. If they found Lu Yen, maybe they can find me, too. Providence seemed to have heard his plea. For just after the priest entered the temple, the giant humanoid monsters followed him, crouching, crawling, or wriggling their way into the sacred building, which looked more like a doghouse for atrocities. The skyscraper-sized colossus struggled to get through the door, but eventually it too disappeared, leaving the altar empty except for the crowd and 100 guards. These guards did not seem particularly threatening, but he did not intend to underestimate them. Their eyes were alert and waves of mental power swirled intimidatingly around them. Maybe I have a chance now. Jake's eyes lit up when he saw that the main threat was gone. Don't try to save them. Too risky. She reminded him succinctly. I know. I'm not senile yet. Jake sked as he took one last look at Sarah and Kevin in the square. I hope so. She knew him better than he knew himself. She knew what was going through his mind right now. Her warning was not just out of concern. Knowing that she was right, Jake jumped off the roof and hovered low in the opposite direction. For today at least, these comrades were safe. He estimated that in 3 or 4 days all the prisoners in that town would have been sacrificed. For days was too little to drastically increase his stats or skills. Even if he succeeded, his comrades would probably already be dead or nearly dead. Alternatively, he could avenge them later. For this reason, Jake intended to return to the volcano and temper his body until the descent of the Phantom Sanctuary. As long as he remained watchful of the Zorian's movements, it would be easy for him to know when the sanctuary would descend. No need to keep an eye on them. You missed part of the Zorian priest's speech, but the bracelet recorded everything. The Phantom Sanctuary won't appear until the number of players has been reduced sufficiently. Since there are only 100 places available, this is probably the condition triggering its descent. Except, the island's Zorians will also be competing with us for those seats. Jake grunted with a gloomy expression. If each Zorian tribe has captured as many prisoners as this one, will be less than 504 days. Probably less, considering that some players would rather commit suicide or sacrifice themselves than be captured. Indeed. What neither Jake nor she mentioned was that the timing of the descent from the Ghost Sanctuary was highly dependent on the talent of the 500 remaining participants. If they were good enough, maybe there was still time. But if they were too good, these giant humanoid monsters of several tens of meters would most certainly be deployed. At that point, it would no longer be a matter of power, but how well they were able to hide. In less than an hour, Jake reached the staircase through which he had come. Cautiously, he checked to see if the humanoid monsters in charge of watching over these entrances had indeed been called back, but when he saw no one, he sighed in relief. Without wasting any more time, he sneaked in and climbed the stairs as fast as he could. With only one direction to go, this passage was perfect for being ambushed. It was always when one feared the worst that it happened. Only halfway to the top of the stairs, his ears twitched when he heard a heavy footstep above him that made the rock walls vibrate. Alerted, he immediately stopped breathing and slowed his heartbeat to a minimum, but he knew by instinct that it was already too late. In fact, as soon as he decisively turned back to avoid meeting this new enemy, he heard footsteps coming from the bottom of the stairs. Both directions were blocked. Closing his eyes for a second, he remembered the untimely death of Liu Yin and the Zorian priest's bracelet, and he knew immediately what had happened. Just as the players could locate each other using their shadow guide, these aliens probably had access to a similar function. After absorbing so many bracelets, chances were that their Oracle device knockoffs were better than their own in some aspects. Aware that he had fallen into the enemy's trap, Jake stopped moping around unnecessarily. Instead of turning back as he intended, he started climbing again, flying at full power. A slight blast exploded behind him, deforming the nearest steps, and like a missile trapped in an updraft, he spiraled upward at breakneck speed. A few seconds later, he met his opponent, a Zorian, but different from the crowd or the guards guarding the prisoners. His aura and physique was not as intimidating as that of the priest, but this alien was undoubtedly an important person in this tribe. The web of ether and mental power within his spirit body was extremely dense, to the point that his own mind resembled that of a child in comparison. But that didn't matter. He had no intention of confronting these Zorians on their preferred terrain, especially after seeing what the priest was capable of by simply saying a few words. When the Zorians saw him, his expression did not change one iota, as if this human was just a rabbit he had intentionally flushed out of his burrow. The glow in his red eyes suddenly intensified as he met his gaze, and Jake felt a mental wave with a distinct frequency enveloping him. Immediately, he felt his lucidity fade into a sordid emotive state, and the Zorian in front of him suddenly appeared much larger and terrifying. In the milliseconds that followed, his mental state fluctuated many times between various unfavorable emotions, oscillating between fear, admiration, fatigue, guilt, and despair. With each cycle, these emotions became more powerful as his spirit body began to resonate with the rhythm of the enemy's mental waves. Biting his tongue to the point of blood so as not to prostrate himself before the enemy, Jake snorted instead and continued to accelerate while ignoring his own mental instability. Seeing the human before him resisting his submission technique, the eyes of the warrior Zorian bulged slightly. Sadly for him, it was too late. Jake rammed into him with the momentum of a race car after a long straight, and a pleasantly soothing sound of broken bones chimed in his ears. Barely slowed down by the impact, Jake continued his flight and hugged his victim tightly as the victim tried to draw the long knife from his belt. As Jake pulled his legs up, he locked the Zorian's hand to prevent him from accessing his weapon. Then, realizing that he had the physical advantage, he braked hard with his feet on the ground and then pushed with all his might. Until then, Jake had flown horizontally across the floor, and by this action, he and his enemy impaled themselves directly onto the ceiling of the gallery. Jake was in a lower position due to his attempted tackle, and it was the Zorian's head that took the full brunt of the impact. The alien's head was hard and did not sink into his chest like a nail, nor did it explode like an egg hitting the ground. However, the Zorian was knocked out by the impact, and his skull bled profusely. Shiny red blood ran down Jake's face, and his thirst for murder was instantly aroused. This was the enemy's weak spot. From the moment his blood had touched Jake's skin, his fate was sealed. His Murtharian bloodline was momentarily pumped up, and this surge of strength gave him the power he needed to defeat his opponent. Even his spirit body had regained the upper hand over the enemy's soul skill. With this boost in strength and speed, Jake unhesitatingly chopped off the Zorian warrior's head, and as he was about to inspect his corpse, he heard the footsteps of his pursuers still in the stairwell. Pressed by time, he simply grabbed the corpse by the leg and fled into the darkness along with his booty. Chapter 3:03 Enjoy your meal. After only a few seconds of running away, Jake realized that the Zorian he had just fought couldn't have been responsible for the heavy footsteps that had shaken the walls of the staircase. This was only possible with a heavy and massive creature. In other words, a dinosaur, or more logically another one of those humanoid monsters. These creatures seemed devoid of any personality, and they clearly obeyed a few privileged Zorians to the letter. This warrior he had just killed was one of them. That's why he was not so surprised when his path was obstructed by the hideous head of one of these monsters at the very first intersection. The creature's head was more than 1.5 meters in diameter with dark skin, yellow fangs, and pointed, partially jagged ears. The underpass was only 2 or 3 meters wide and high, and obviously had not been designed to provide easy access for such large monsters. Because of this, as when the humanoid monsters had crawled out of the temple, the red-eyed creature in front of him was clumsily crouched and had to wriggle like a caterpillar to advance a few meters. Recognizing that he could not avoid the confrontation and that it was an unhoped-for opportunity, Jake sped up a notch and thrust his machete forward. With his momentum and striking power, his blade sank all the way to the hilt in one of the monster's eyes. Then Jake contracted his muscles a little more, and the arm holding the weapon in turn went into the monster's eye, up to the shoulder. It was gore as hell, but the creature's brain was reduced to mush in an instant without it being able to react. Ruhr, blinded by the pain and the blade in his eye, the hanging red stone around the monster's neck began to radiate an intense light, and the monster dying in front of him suddenly came back to life, carried by a fury from another world. The creature that should have been dying jolted suddenly and tried to stand upright by pushing down with all its might. Under the flinchium's influence, its body had begun to congest and grow as it emitted an inconceivable bestial aura. Jake was taken aback and forced to drop his machete when the monster managed to stand upright. His current posture was like that of the Atlas sculpture carrying the earth on his shoulders, except that above the monster there was only a rock ceiling, and as he tried to force himself up, the ceiling had begun to crack. Fuck! Aware of what was about to happen, Jake recalled his machete with his telekinesis after breaking through the creature's reddish aura with his spirit body. Then without a second thought, he snatched the red crystal from the monster's neck to disrupt his berserk mode. Unfortunately, in doing so, it was he who found himself in contact with an active red soul stone. His body had already been sprayed with blood during his previous fight, and destroying the eye of this creature had also sprayed his body with all kinds of enemy fluids. His body glittered with a beautiful fluorescent red where it had been stained. The outcome of such stimulation was inevitable. In a split second he saw red and his consciousness was incinerated with the magnificence of a firework explosion. When Jake regained his lucidity long afterwards, he did not immediately recognize where he was. Miraculously, he was still alive, but barely. According to his status, he weighed only 38 kilos. He could only imagine how glorious he must have been when facing the enemy to survive until now. But right now his situation was even more critical than the previous time with Liu Yan. If it had been him from the second trial, he knew he would never have regained his lucidity. He would have died of exhaustion long before. Died. At that thought, Jake immediately inspected his body and his surroundings to try to understand why he was lucid again. The blood on him had dried, and his machete was nowhere to be found. Strangely enough, his clawed hand was still firmly holding the ankle of the Zorian he had defeated, but the corpse was in a terrible state. Without a doubt, Berserk Jake had used the corpse as a club to retaliate against his opponents. The body was still pretty much in one piece, but it was only flesh and skin at that point. More importantly, the corpse was completely charred. The red crystals he had stolen had also disappeared, but that was normal. If he hadn't gotten rid of them somehow, he wouldn't have survived. But why the hell was his machete gone? Without the Naquat crystal embedded in the pommel, he should have been unable to neutralize the influence of flinchium. He had seen the result on Liu Yan. Even though he was mentally and physically stronger than her, the difference was not so extreme. Thank God you're awake. Xi's voice echoed unannounced in his head. It was clearly tinged with relief. Do you even believe in God? He managed to mock with a small laugh, but he immediately regretted his action. He was practically voiceless, and his laugh triggered a dry and sore coughing fit. When he stopped coughing, there was a little blood in his hand, and he felt like he was about to collapse. Finally, he whispered, "Where am I and why am I still alive?" Thanks to your instincts, I guess. Prolonged contact with all that flinchium has boosted your Murtharian bloodline to an unprecedented level. When I thought it was all over and you were going to die, you started devouring your machete, green soulstone included. You went into a coma a few seconds later, and I thought it was the end, but a minute later you woke up and swallowed the other 2 red crystals. What did I do? Jake gasped in amazement. No wonder his machete was gone. He remembered then that he did indeed have the ability to digest almost anything with his bloodline, but perhaps out of caution and common sense, he hadn't particularly sought to test the limits of that talent. Knowing that he could eat any food without wondering too much about compatibility had been enough for him. And honestly, who would be foolish enough to try to eat a sword? In short, the most important thing was that he had survived. He first had to understand his situation and act accordingly. By scanning his surroundings, Jake was able to confirm that he was still under the volcano, but he had never explored this place. Obviously, he had not fully escaped the Zorians. He was in a kind of cave, but the smooth ceiling and walls as well as the right angles proved that it was not of natural origin. You built it yourself when you were in berserk mode. Seriously? Jake was getting more and more skeptical about his recent actions. Was he really that capable when he was unconscious? Maybe he had more potential as a sleepwalker. There was neither entrance nor exit in the artificial cave he had created. Even when he scanned behind the rock walls, he found only more rock. There were no galleries dug nearby. He had been able to get in here with his temporary power up, but getting out might be another matter. He was seriously considering his options when he heard a familiar sound above him, comparable to a river flowing freely. Raising his head to the ceiling, he squinted his eyes as he deployed his mental power in one direction and was shocked to discover that he was just below the lava lake. Tell me the truth. How did I get here? Radio silence. After a while, his Oracle AI breathed a long, exasperated sigh. Through the lake. How? Jake inquired calmly. Jake was at peace. He could not be constantly surprised. It had already been a day full of twists and turns. One more or less didn't make any difference. You had already reached your hiding place in the volcano when you gobbled up the 3 crystals. After swallowing the 2 red soul stones, you threw yourself into the lava lake on your own. And I'm still alive. Jake found the situation increasingly absurd. Finally, fed up, the hologram of she appeared in front of him. Leaning against a wall in front of him, she simply replied, "Take a look at your status." Listening to her advice, he started scrolling down his status looking for anomalies. But although his stats had increased quite a bit, both etherically and physically, the difference was not life-changing. Lower. She rolled her eyes cutely. Then, Jake reached the section about his Murtharian bloodline, and he finally noticed a change in size. Grade 8 Murtharian bloodline, level 2. In just a few hours, and by eating a few crystals, he had managed to stimulate his bloodline enough to move it to the next rank. Chapter 304 Bloodline Upgrade. Jake stared at these few words for a long time. The difference was only 1 digit, but the implications were staggering. Grade 8 Murtharian bloodline, level 2. Murtharian body LVL2, the robustness of a Cantharian, combined with the intellect of an Altarian and the fighting instinct of a Myrmidian. The physical and brain abilities are 4 times, twice at LVL1, as good as a normal human, but without the limitations. Your digestive abilities allow you to digest almost anything in a short time. At each additional level, the physical and mental abilities will be doubled, as well as the speed of progression, tolerance to heat, pressure, and radiation. Murtharian spirit body LVL2. The Altarian spirit body solidifies the spirit body and strengthens the Cantharian ether skills by adding telekinesis. The spirit body of a Murtharian is 6 times greater, thrice at LVL1, than that of a normal human and has a natural instinct conferring a form of prescience. These faculties double at every level. Murtharian soul LVL2, slight heat, earth and light, radiation, attribute, attributeless at LVL1. Able to feed on the ether contained in heat or radiation to survive and strengthen itself. Ether bloodline skills. Accelerated Murtharian LVL2 growth, closely related to positivity, determination, pride, fighting, and anger. The effect doubles with each level. Accelerated Murtharian LVL2 decline, closely related to negativity, shame, weakness of mind, fear, and feelings of defeat and failure. The effect doubles with each level. Self-encoding. There are no longer any limits to the ether stats, as the ether is constantly being compressed to make room. However, the cost in ether required to increase stats will quickly become exponential. Using the ether encoded by the Oracle device to increase the ether stats is no longer recommended if the encoding level doesn't match. Ether and soul tribute. A defeated enemy will surrender a fraction of his ether and soul in proportion to the threat he posed to the bloodline holder. Warrior Murtharian Trance LVL2. As a result of the above-mentioned emotions and the will to vanquish in battle, the body stats will be temporarily increased by 100-200%, 50-100% at LVL1. The effect doubles with each level. Spiritual Murtharian Trance LVL2. By calming the mind through meditation, it is possible to amplify the mental stats as well as the quality of the spirit body from 100-200%, 50-100% at LVL1. The effect doubles on every level. Spiritual Murtharian Eyes LVL2. It becomes possible upon activation to analyze one's opponents to understand their physical, mental, and etheric weaknesses. Passively, it is possible to see ether at a certain distance without going through the extrasensory perception of the spirit body. With each additional level, it will be possible to obtain more information. Stone Skin LVL2. The body can withstand high temperatures and radiation, including high pressure and friction. Heat and radiation tolerance LVL2. The body temperature is no longer fixed at 37 degrees Celsius and can withstand a much higher internal temperature without shutting down. Earth manipulation LVL2. Including all the minerals, atoms, and inorganic traces found in the soil of Kinther's home planet, which is a small volcanic telluric planet very close to its sun. At LVL2 you can now bend rocks and boulders to your will. The delicacy of control and perception doubles at every level. Heat and radiation control LVL2. It becomes possible to thermally and energetically excite any object, including one's own body. At LVL2, you can now perform basic heat and radiation manipulation. The finesse of control and perception doubles at every level. Telekinesis LVL2. It becomes possible to control objects remotely via the spirit body. At spirit body and physical body equivalent, it is only possible to exert 100%, 50% at LVL1 of the strength of the physical body. Control is also limited to simple actions. The effect doubles at each level. Accelerated healing LVL2. It is possible to heal even the most lethal and disabling wounds by burying oneself underground in a warm space. At LVL2, the body acquires a passive regeneration ability without any need to bury oneself. Half the effect and can't regrow limbs. Dependent on the environment, the body's tolerance to heat, radiation, and the quality of the soil. Spirit of Revenge. After a defeat, and if the host's will has not wavered, the bloodline will be greatly stimulated. It was pretty scary. Jake couldn't really feel the difference right now because of his weakened state, but the simple fact that each of his bloodline skills had doubled in potency meant that he could now take on a dozen of the old him without even breaking a sweat. Take telekinesis, for example. At LVL2, the power of his telekinesis had doubled, but his telekinesis was also dependent on his intelligence, perception, and extrasensory perception stats, as well as the resilience of his spirit body, which had all doubled accordingly. This meant that his telekinesis was now 4 to 8 times more powerful than before, not to mention other stats such as constitution and vitality that would allow him to spam his ether skills without any restraint. His body status hadn't changed much, but now that he was aware of the power-up of his bloodline, he noted a change in one small detail. Thankfully, he hadn't grown too much. Body status. Physics. Murtharian body, LVL2. Height. 2.14 meters. 2.11/U003 E 2.14 meters. Weight, 38 kilograms. Strength, 74 points, 68.3/U003 E74. Agility, 66 points, 60.5/U003 E66. Constitution, 94.3 points, 87.2/U003 E94.3. Vitality, 91.6 points, 84.6/U003 E91.6. Intelligence, 39.1 points, 36.4/U003 E39.1. Perception, 32.8 points, 31.6/U003 E32.8. NB. Average human stats, 2.5 points, 5 points when his bloodline was LVL1 and 10 points when he was still human. In other words, even though his body stats had improved only slightly, His actual capabilities had doubled. Even regardless of his ether stats, his body's ability had already far surpassed that of any human. The best Earth athlete or genius was probably between 7 and 10 points for his highest body stats. Such was the importance of a high-grade bloodline. Trying to remain human at all costs was completely stupid if one had any kind of ambition or a well-developed survival instinct. When Jake had finished discovering his new abilities, he had a big childish smile reaching up to his ears. He was as happy as a child who had just received his Christmas presents early. He had completely forgotten his frailty, aching, and thirst. And most importantly, Jake raised his head again towards the lava lake above him with a mischievous expression. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? It might work, but you'll have to get your strength back first. You should also. As she said these last words, her mocking gaze drifted down to his crotch before meeting his gaze again with a smug face. Following his AI's gaze, Jake noticed that he was indeed naked. His leather armor had not survived his lava bath. The armor itself he didn't care, but the wasted gray ether was lost forever. The good news was that his appearance hadn't changed much. He still looked mostly human. Suddenly, he remembered that he had also devoured his machete. What had happened to the gray ether inside? Could his body really digest such energy, or had it also dissipated? He got the answer after further physical inspection. The gray ether had not disappeared. It had simply concentrated in its claws and fangs. Every claw, hair, and tooth in his body seemed to be considered as a separate entity. The enhancement was not much after it had been evenly distributed, but it was not negligible either. The sharpness and strength of his claws and fangs had increased by about 25%. This was not really a problem at the moment, but it could become dangerous if a normal human came in contact with them. Fortunately, he could retract his fangs and claws with a simple thought. Once the plan was established, Jake took action. With a simple thought, and without the slightest difficulty, he managed to accomplish what the Cantharian Geralf had once accomplished in front of him at the end of the first ordeal, diving into a rock ceiling as if it were simply water. In one jump, he burrowed into the ceiling and swam up until he reached the volcanic chamber. As expected, he felt the heat increase, until the rock around him began to glow red. However, it was no longer unpleasant. Instead, his new passive regeneration was activated and the pores of his skin opened to absorb the magmatic rock. His body in turn turned red like a piece of hot metal, and his body temperature rose rapidly. Watching his body status, he then saw his weight of 38 kilograms increase sharply. Direct contact with lava was still too risky for him, but was no longer lethal. His vitality and constitution formed a status quo, allowing him to recover easily from these levels of burns. Once he was less than a meter away from the volcanic chamber, Jake closed his eyes and began to meditate on the spot while waiting for the healing to take place. Approximately 8 hours later, he was back to his original weight and beyond. He now weighed over 200 kilograms. During this forced convalescence, Jake did not twiddle his thumbs. He was now familiar with his new abilities, and he had never felt so overpowered. For the very first time in his life, he was truly confident, as if nothing could stop him to succeed. Chapter 305 Evil Plan. He had also discovered something crucial during his forced introspection. The soul stones he had devoured had not disappeared. Sure, they had been digested by some unknown process, but the Naquat and Flintium ores were still in him under another form. The atoms of these two otherworldly materials had amalgamated together and had invaded most of his cells. This was a big part of the reason why his Murtharian bloodline had undergone a power-up. Because his body had a higher than normal temperature and the ability to generate its own radiation, the energy inside the soul stones was completely snuffed out and harmless right now for better or worse. On the other hand, it had also provided him with a simple way to counteract the noxious energy of these crystals. He could already produce heat, light, and radiation before his bloodline had evolved, but his control had been somewhat limited. Among other things, he had been unable to consciously produce ultraviolet waves. This was now possible. It wasn't that he had become able to calibrate the electromagnetic wavelength to the nearest nanometer, but that he now had a natural instinct to perform such feats. As in a video game, his skill tree had branched out and the possibilities had multiplied. Producing infrared, visible light, or ultraviolet light was just about as difficult for him as moving his hand. No sooner said than done. Jake applied this new method without qualms. Soon his body began to emit a bright ultraviolet light, invisible to normal humans. For him it made no difference. But those who would approach him with an insufficient constitution could easily suffer irreversible eye damage by staring at him for too long. And the best news of the day was that the Zorians and their minions clearly did not like sunlight. In an instant, he had become their worst nemesis. He couldn't wait to face them again. Coming back to reality, Jake checked the player ranking and the time. It was 5:30 in the morning, and less than 800 participants were still alive. An additional 100 players had been eliminated during the night. Fortunately, Sarah, Kate, and Kevin were still breathing. Out of principle, he took the opportunity to monitor the situation of his other companions and cousins. Of his family, apart from Lily, Kate, and Kevin, only Bryce and George were still in the running. All the others had been eliminated. Will and Inya were holding on, while Tim and the two Zewids were together with Lily. There was nothing to report on that side, although he couldn't help but praise Will and Inya's performance. At the ordeal's beginning, these two were clearly not the ones he would have bet on. As for the top of the ranking, it was pretty stable. Despite the constant bloodshed among the other participants, their scores were only increasing. Whether the Zorians were chasing them or not was not enough to stop these players from achieving glory. Jake himself was still ranked 19th with more than 10 M points. The current quest was already at a satisfactory level of exploration, and he could finish it whenever he wanted. However, the Zorian town still had many secrets, and he felt that ending the quest now would be a huge mistake. After winning a few soul glyphs, Jake was particularly sensitive to the notion of a job well done. Whatever the mission, he had to see it through to the end, no matter where it led him. 2 new hunting feats had also been activated when he had vanquished his first Zorians. Zorian Hunter, Gold. 3 Zorian killed equals \U003 E next milestone. 7 out of 10. Zorian Thrall Hunter, Platinum. 8 Zorians killed. Equals \U003 E next milestone. 18 out of 100. Ugh, it looked like he had killed a bunch of enemies during his berserk mode. Or rather, the ones he had faced were pretty strong. The description under the feat stated that the number of points awarded to him depended on the level of dangerousness of the defeated enemy. It didn't work like that with the other island animals. Zorian Thrall. Jake repeated, stroking his chin pensively. Probably their servants who look like giant buff golems. She remarked in his mind. It makes sense. Jake kicked these monsters out of his mind and refocused himself on the plan. First, he returned to his artificial cave and meticulously studied the charred corpse of the warrior Zorian. Naturally, he tried to absorb the enemy's bracelet, but to no avail. The logical conclusion to draw was that just like them, these Zorians would not really die on this island. The bracelet had been repatriated with the soul of the deceased. Of course, the possibility remained that this particular Zorian did not have a bracelet, but that was unlikely. This alien had encountered no difficulty in tracking him and Liu Yan. Well, that would serve as a valuable lesson to him. If he had to obtain the title of Arm Chopper to achieve his goal, he would gladly accept it. If he could get a soul glyph as compensation, that would be perfect. Jake's heart was big enough to accept such a burden. Feeling she's disdain for him, Jake set to work. The corpse being useless, he tossed it against the edge of the basement with a telekinetic flick and then slid into the ground. The rock under his feet seemingly liquefied, and he began to fall into the ground. Literally. After about 30 seconds, Jake broke his fall when his senses detected a large air pocket. Red crystals appeared in his mind, and he recognized the fake stars lighting the vault at the top of the Zorian cave. Faced with so much flinchium, he increased the ultraviolet light output, and their wicked influence vanished as if it had never existed. He then tilted head down, and soon after, he popped down out of the cave's ceiling. According to the previous day's pattern, he still had a few hours left before the sacrifices resumed, and most of the Zorians should have been going about their business. Being normally nocturnal creatures, it was surprising that the sacrifices took place during the day, but it was also possible that these aliens did not need sleep. The cave was still dark, but this was to his advantage. Silently, he activated his Mertharian sight, and the etheric signatures in his field of vision less than 150 meters away appeared in front of him. In the midst of all those brilliant flinchium stones, The galactic glow radiating from his eyes was not conspicuous at all. At a glance, Jake discovered that he was close to the edge of the cave, and the place was relatively desolate and seedy. Seeing that the Zorian's density was almost zero and that there were no guards stationed below him, he relaxed markedly, not that he was particularly stressed. On the contrary, he was rather excited as before a skydiving jump. Jake mentally assessed the distance to the volcanic chamber, then disappeared again into the rock ceiling and headed straight towards his fellow prisoners. A few minutes later, he stopped not far from the temple at the other end of the city. The prisoners were locked in steel cages a few hundred meters from the place where the sacrifices had occurred. Clearly, no one seemed to care about them nor bothered to feed them. They were all going to die anyway. Most of the locked players had needed to urinate at one time or another, and the overcrowded cages reeked of both ammonia and perspiration. Scanning the cages below him, Jake spotted Sarah and his two cousins at a glance. Then seeing that they were more or less alive, he turned around to take the next step in his plan. If they had been too badly wounded to be rescued, it would have been disappointing after he had prepared such a nice surprise for these fucking Zorians. By the way, these aliens were apparently cannibals. Jake had just seen a couple of Zorians roasting a frail one as he passed by. This place was a dog-eat-dog world. Now that he had assessed the distances and located the prisoners, he could move on to the third stage. A few minutes later, he had returned to his makeshift cave. He took a few more minutes to calm down with long breaths, and then he took action. Diving into the rock again, Jake flew back to the volcanic chamber. Yeah, his evil plan was simply to bury the Zorian city under lava. At first, he thought it would be a piece of cake after upgrading his bloodline, but of course it couldn't be that easy. The Zorians were not stupid and had been careful to build their city slightly off-center with respect to the magma chamber. This was expected, since otherwise their basement would have been breached by the volcanic conduit coming from the Earth's mantle, and it would have been their cave instead that would have become a magma chamber if the lava had poured directly into their city. Anyway, this was not a problem for Jake. Just a simple setback. Instead of digging a vertical drainage pipe, he would simply have to angle it enough so that the lava would spill where he wanted it to. Handling such a large amount of lava with his powers was difficult, but digging a tunnel was relatively simple. As Jake wore a sadistic smile on his face, the drain that would send the Chaos Tribe to their doom gradually took shape. Chapter 306 Fuck You All. When Jake had an idea, he could be pretty damn thorough to get it done. In addition to digging a discharge tunnel for the lava pouring directly above the sacrificial altar, he also created a branch-off tunnel for the lava coming up the volcanic conduit from the depths of the earth. This channel would lead to the fortuitous emergence of a lava fountain right in the middle of the crowd. He had tried to dig directly beneath the temple, including under the sacrificial altar, without success. The catacombs beneath the altar and temple looked more like a giant vault than a simple basement. He could now bend the rock to his will, but such thick metal was beyond his grasp. About 6 hours later, his stratagem was finally ready. Even with his new abilities, his body was dripping with sweat, and without his passive regeneration that spontaneously activated when he moved through hot rock, he might not have been able to do it so quickly. In an icy environment, digging such tunnels would certainly have taken him several days. His artificial cavern seemed perfectly safe and habitable, but its proximity to the magma chamber ensured that the temperatures inside were far above what a normal human could withstand. The air was so hot that it clouded the visibility inside the cave, and every drop of sweat would evaporate instantly upon contact with the ground. If an evolver like Sarah or Lu Yin had set foot in there, they might not have died because of their constitution and decent vitality, but the pain felt would have been comparable to being boiled alive. Jake had been monitoring the situation in the Zorian city by making quick trips back and forth from time to time, and he knew that the sacrifices had already resumed about an hour ago. Once again, according to the player ranking, the number of players eliminated was greater than the number of prisoners sacrificed at the altar in the last hour. Clearly, the other two tribes were practicing slaughter of a similar nature, although this was only his own supposition. The tunnels were ready, but he still had a few small details to finalize. To prevent the lava from spilling out too quickly, he had kept a few meters of rock as plugs that he could remove at any time. For fear that these plugs would collapse because of the heat and the weight of the lava, they were right at the entrance of the two tunnels, in contact with the magma chamber and the volcanic conduit, but also at the bottom and at the top of the Zorian cave. This meant that even if the first two plugs blocking the lava were destroyed, it would still take a few minutes for the lava to reach the Zorian cave. Once the lava was in place, he could then blow the roof and floor of the cave so that the lava could pour into the city from above and below at the same time. The only real difficulty was that the two tunnels were in opposite positions and were separated by the city and an army of Zorian thralls. In order to blow the two stoppers, Jake would have to swim around the city through the rock fast enough for the two lava traps to be triggered almost simultaneously. Alas, even at his maximum speed, there would still be a gap between the two traps. He could have made plugs of different thicknesses so that the timing would be the same, but there were too many factors to consider, and he didn't have time for that. Even with his current intelligence, he still preferred to follow a simple plan where all the parameters were under his control. At that very moment, Jake had just gotten into position. He had just blasted the lava plugs at the entrance of the magma chamber and the volcanic conduit, and was patiently waiting for the lava to fill the two tunnels. He initially thought that the lava would have spread at high velocity like a faucet opened to the fullest, but the viscosity of the molten rock was higher than he expected. Instead of flowing rapidly, the lava was pouring into the two tunnels at the speed of a snail, which frustrated him greatly. Ugh, how boring. Jake yawned as he stuck his head out of the ground near the building where he had attended the sacrifices the previous day. The Zorian priest was back in his demonic form and had the same psychotic smile. The Zorian thralls were also present, and that was why Jake chose this vantage point instead of camping near the first tunnel that was supposed to explode near the crowd. The moment he would take action, he would be instantly discovered. He had already taken huge risks by digging a tunnel so close. If one of the Zorian warriors inadvertently decided to scan the underground with his spirit body, there was a good chance that his plan would be discovered. Though, even if that happened, it was already too late to prevent the worst from happening. Unless one of these aliens had superior Earth manipulation abilities to his own, it was unlikely. Jake was prepared for it, anyway. These underground galleries had not dug themselves out. It was obvious to anyone with eyes and a little common sense that these aliens were pretty good at it. As Jake waited patiently for the lava to flow to the fateful place, something happened. Sarah was chosen as a sacrifice. Jake, who had until then been rather relaxed to the point of yawning with boredom in front of all these gory deaths, suddenly stiffened when he saw the young blonde being dragged by her hair to the altar. Fuck, he cursed between his clenched teeth. The lava was far from being in position. It would take a few more minutes before the trap was operational. Counting the seconds mentally, Jake hesitated, but when he saw the blonde transform under the influence of the purified flinchium energy, he forgot all about it. In a split second, the young woman's neutral aura flared up and turned bestial and chaotic. Her golden hair began to lengthen and shine like a super scion, while her golden irises began to radiate like two flashlights. Her tan skin gained a kind of bronze luster, while her height and musculature developed slightly, but still aesthetically pleasing. Nothing like the horrendous mutations of some of the participants. The Myrmidians were indeed a blessed ancient species whose reputation in the mirror universe was well established. The energy contained in the red crystal forming this altar was so pure and intense that the 3 stones he had devoured were nothing in comparison. At that very moment, Sarah was dramatically stronger than before. After upgrading his own bloodline to level 2, he could tell at a glance that this corresponded to at least a Myrmidian bloodline of level 5 or higher. Unfortunately, this bloodline did not improve her physical abilities very much, so physically Sarah's body was still frail and unable to withstand such power. By activating her Myrtharian trance, her ether stats had indeed been multiplied, but this energy had to come from somewhere. Even before the Zorian priest moved a little finger, Sarah's berserk mode had already ended, extinguishing like the flame of a candle dipped in water. Jake watched helplessly as the young woman collapsed to the ground half unconscious like a puppet with her strings cut, and watched grudgingly as the Zorian priest lowered his blade to cut off one of her arms, followed by Sarah's muffled cry of agony. "What are you waiting for to save her?" she complained as she watched the disgusting performance through his eyes. "It's not time yet," Jake replied uncomfortably with a frown. "Does it really matter? You're a Myrtharian. If you go against your instincts, It's like admitting defeat. In that case, perhaps it's better to take the risk, even if it means dying. But that will screw up my perfect plan. Jake grunted as he watched Sarah have her second arm cut off. Right now, her breath was short and wheezy, as if she was giving birth with a knife in her belly. The pain she was feeling right now was probably worse. It was in those moments that Jake knew he wasn't in love. His survival instincts were still overriding his desire to save her. She would survive anyway. Maybe he would have reasoned differently if death on this island was final. Jake was still hesitating when something happened that he could never have foreseen. Sarah's eyes, rolling in all directions in search of any hope, miraculously fell on him. When her gaze locked on his, he felt the last chain holding his rationality break. It was no miracle. It was no more and no less than her shadow guide giving her a way out. Perhaps many prisoners had long been aware of his presence and were patiently biding their time. As if most of the prisoners were one and the same person, their hopeful and sometimes cynical gaze turned in the same direction as the young woman's. Immediately afterwards, the particularly receptive Zorian priest turned to him, followed by all the guards and Zorian thralls. When Jake felt the demonic gaze of the skyscraper-sized thrall descend upon him, he felt a horrible shiver run through his spinal cord. He had been tricked. "Fuck you all," he roared as he vanished into the ground. All the compassion he had been feeling for Sarah was utterly gone. Chapter 307 Wreaking Havoc. And yet, despite the urgency of the situation, Jake did not panic. He may have insulted them all inwardly, but it was only an expression of his momentary frustration. He didn't really care. He had never relied on his plan A. On the other hand, there was one thing he was certain of: Sarah's oracle rank was no better than his own. In other words, she couldn't screw him even if she wanted to. Sarah's plea for help, although it exposed his position, was not at odds with the success of his plan. However, this did not mean that there were not ill-intentioned prisoners among these participants. The Nosk, at least, must have had a higher oracle rank than his own, and he was certainly not the only one. Nevertheless, knowing the pride of this species, there was little chance that it had conspired against him with the help of its shadow guide. In any case, they were all in chains. There wasn't much they could do in their circumstances, or they would never have been captured in the first place. Time to play. Jake sneered as he moved underground towards the crowd. The lava wasn't in place yet, but he only had a few seconds to wait. Instead of waiting for the rock plug under the crowd to melt or explode because of the lava flow, he could just as easily destroy it prematurely. And so he did. A moment later, Jake was floating in the air in the middle of the tunnel he had dug himself, and a glance underneath him confirmed that the lava was only a few meters away. Standing sideways between the lava and the ground beneath the crowd, Jake spread his arms and a fiery aura began to glow around him as he activated his powers. The smooth edges of the tunnel around him began to glow as the temperature in the rocky conduit quickly rose above that of a furnace. Then Jake's eyes suddenly opened wide as he intensified his focus, and the rocky floor beneath the crowd was instantly lifted off the ground, propelled up like some telekinetic cannonball. The 20 or so Zorian civilians who were still watching Sarah's sacrifice with excitement unsuspectingly were fatally rewarded with their first air baptism. Like a fireworks display that had just exploded, each of these Zorians was hurled at high speed in a different direction, their condition unknown. Then Jake's hand grasped the void behind him as if he wanted to grab something, and a lava sphere about 2 meters in diameter was immediately scooped out of the lava river below him. Next, his pupils ignited by emitting their characteristic galactic glow, and his lava veins began to show through his skin. The lava ball then divided into multiple ogive-shaped projectiles a few centimeters long and aligned themselves neatly like the bullets from the magazine of a heavy machine gun. Soon after, Jake grabbed the void again, and the rock lining the tunnel distorted, before sticking to his body piece by piece to form a makeshift armor that covered almost every exposed part of his body. To complete the outfit, a cleaver at least 2 meters long landed in his right hand to replace the machete he had lost. Without blinking, he spent 500 ether points to max out the 100 gray ether points of his new weapon. Considering that he had more than 10 million ether points on him, and that he was gambling his life right now, he also decided to be generous to himself, even if it brought some trouble later on. 10,000 ether points allowed him to max out the gray ether of his 20 claws, while an additional 16,000 points allowed him to max out his 32 teeth. Too bad that self-encoding did not apply to Gray Ether, which unfortunately was not part of his bloodline. Regardless, it was more than enough to transform his heavy rock sword and his already sharp claws into genuine killing weapons. Of course, he did not neglect his temporary armor either. With a few thousand less ether points, he also leveled the rock plates covering his body. Jake, at that very moment, looked nothing less than a miniature Black Optimus Prime. He felt fucking awesome. And when the Zorians and the prisoners saw him come out of his hole, they felt this too. Lava bullet after lava bullet burst into the brains of all the Zorians nearby to the cadence of a machine gun, and tragically the prisoners were not spared either. With the exception of the area where Sarah, Kevin, and Kate were, Jake fired wherever there was any life form, even remotely humanoid. It only took a few seconds for Jake to run out of his lava ammunition, but during that brief interval half of the crowd had been exterminated. Projectiles of molten rock smoked on the ground or sizzled in their victims' brains. Chaos had descended upon the sacrifice square, and the guards were utterly powerless to calm the prevailing madness. Seeing the human who had just slaughtered half the civilians of his tribe, the Zorian priest, who was still in his berserk form, shed tears of blood. "You dare? Let me show you what happens when a vermin like you tries to be a hero." The alien shrieked, pointing a trembling finger of fury at him. "Who said anything about being a hero?" Jake snorted as he beheaded another 10 civilians by lifting a twist of hot air with his new sword. "I'm just here to kill." Perceiving the arrogance of this human whose features under his armor were indistinguishable, the priest went mad instantly. "And you speak Oraclean too? Good. It will be even better when you beg me in a short while. Thralls, bring him to my feet alive. I don't care in what state, as long as he's still breathing. Unless I sacrifice him today before my people, I hereby pledge that my soul will never be at peace." When the priest finished his injunction, the giant humanoid monsters that had barely moved an eyelash since the beginning of the attack started moving as if a paused movie had just resumed. The guards in charge of watching the prisoners were not to be outdone and drew their weapons. Some of them grabbed the red soulstone's pendants for a temporary power boost, but none of their berserk mode was as good as that of the priest. When the guards came at him, Jake stood still with his arms dangling. It was exactly what he wanted. His Zorian hunter feat was progressing nicely, but it wasn't nearly good enough for his ambitions that on top of that, the expected lava geyser would be here in no time. The priest wasn't just there to decorate. He was one of the best fighters of his tribe, especially after being washed by the purified soul energy of the altar. The reason why he was weakening more slowly compared to the others was because his vitality had been trained for that very purpose. In his normal form, this Zorian was as persistent as a cockroach with decent agility, but his actual strength was under par. In his berserk form, on the other hand, he was a strike force able to scare even the most hardened warrior. Naturally, he had no intention of letting these guards face the danger alone. By staying at the center of the altar, his mental abilities and Zorian skills were also enhanced, and he was confident that no second-class player could withstand his psychic attacks. The high-frequency etheric wave that Jake had experienced the day before without being the intended target exploded again, this time directly targeting him. Within milliseconds, Jake's spirit body began to vibrate and resonate to the beat of this insidious attack, and he felt his determination waver and his lucidity wane. At this rate, he would be transformed into a fanatical retard in less than 10 seconds. However, that was only if he did nothing. His spirit body and brain stats had doubled between yesterday and today. Just by applying his method from the day before, he was not helpless at all. Yet he had an even better solution. While the guards and the priest thought it was in the bag, a faint grin crept up on Jake's face behind his helmet. From the gaps between his armor plates, his exposed skin began to glow, but none of the Zorians could see this light. Only a few prisoners closed their eyes reflexively. Aerf! A sound of roasted flesh sizzled in the air, followed by a barbecue smell. The guards who had been rushing at him with confidence were now rolling on the ground, trying to escape the infernal pain. As for the priest, his membranous wings had folded in front of him to protect the rest of his body, and they were barely holding on. Still, there were bits of skin and scales falling off regularly, as if the wings were peeling off. Sunlight? No, ultraviolet light. The priest instantly understood what had happened. Jake wasn't the first participant to possess abilities that countered their bloodline. The other thralls were also screaming in agony, and each of their stray footsteps would crush or destroy a building. Only the skyscraper-sized thrall seemed indifferent. Its skin was so thick and hard that it was able to endure these rays by its sheer constitution. The priest had not missed this detail and immediately ordered him to exterminate the human before it could wreak further havoc. Alas, when the giant thrall wanted to take action, the human was already gone. Instead, a lava fountain had gushed out of the ground, and a pool of molten rock was slowly but surely drowning the altar place. Chapter 308 Chaos Everywhere. Just after Jake disappeared underground, a huge boom shook the earth, the resulting jolts nearly causing him to lose control of his ether. The epicenter was exactly where he had been a mere second ago. If that had happened, the hundreds of tons of rock around him would have buried him in an instant. His body was strong enough to withstand that kind of pressure, like a block of metal could support the weight of a mountain without necessarily breaking, but it definitely would not have been without consequence. A block of metal was not hollow, which was not the case with his skull or rib cage. His soft tissues were not prepared for such a test, even with his stone skin skill. Sure, he would have survived, but he would not have been able to carry out his genius plan. Speaking of genius plan, Phase 1 went pretty much as planned, and he was already reveling in the reaction that this Zorian priest would have when he triggered the second trap. While Jake silently propelled himself through the rock like a rocket, the Zorian thralls were still searching for the culprit. Some of them had already begun sacrificing themselves under the orders of the priest and the Zorian warriors who commanded them. These humanoid creatures had virtually no free will, as did animals with a crystal inlaid in their foreheads. In this case, several of these monsters had thrown themselves into the lava fountain and had already partially blocked the hole by obstructing it with their own bodies. Other thralls, accompanied by a few guards, were in charge of dispersing the crowd of civilians to safety. The guards in charge of monitoring the prisoners were in an extreme state of alert after seeing their ranks so easily decimated by Jake a moment earlier. All the abilities of this player seemed to counter perfectly theirs to the point that they had a hard time putting the docile prisoners under their control and this player in the same league. This was a terrible mistake. Some prisoners who had not made a wave since their capture, seemingly having given up on escape, suddenly went into action after exchanging a tacit glance with each other. The Nosk who was sitting cross-legged on the ground was one of these prisoners. His luck could be considered extremely bad for having been treated like trash by these Zorian cannibals. This Nosk was not very belligerent and relatively cautious compared to other members of his species who were always looking for tastier and more respectable prey. This was normal after all, since he was the weakest of his species to participate in this ordeal. Nevertheless, he should not be underestimated. He was still in the top 50 of the player ranking. While his ordeal was going well, the Chaos Tribe had suddenly started to capture and exterminate the participants, and he had at first easily repelled the first wave of assailants. Except that he had only eliminated the crystal fiends under their control, not the Zorian controlling them. After estimating its capabilities, the Zorian had called for reinforcement, and a thrall more than 50 meters high was then deployed. As strong as he was, he had been crushed in seconds. Another Nosk had also been captured during the blizzard a few weeks earlier, but had long since been sacrificed. Back then, these Zorians weren't even actively chasing the players, so his fellow Nosk's luck could be considered even worse than his own. Such a story was not so uncommon among the prisoners. Of the more or less 150 players captured, 5 of them were among the top 100 and had experienced similar misadventures. Jake had almost experienced the same thing when a Zorian warrior on his trail ambushed him on the stairs at the entrance to the city. These Zorians had their own bracelets so they could easily find the participants, but until they knew their appearance and name, it was impossible for them to specifically target them. However, a few sacrifices and a mental submission technique was enough to loosen their tongues. The leaders of this Zorian tribe had long since obtained all the details of the player ranking. They had the name of each participant as well as their ranking and kills. This gave them a clear idea of the participants' dangerousness. The reason why Jake had not been hunted like his comrades was simply because he was higher ranked. The Zorians simply wanted to reduce the number of players competing before the arrival of the Phantom Sanctuary, not take unnecessary risks. It was only now that the ordeal was nearing its end and the less able participants had been taken prisoner or sacrificed that they began to chase the higher-ranked players more actively. If Jake had not decided to explore the secret passage by slaughtering all the enslaved creatures under their control, the Zorians would not have cared about him so soon. Those top 100 prisoners who had been captured or killed were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, or had by their actions provoked the ire of this tribe. The Nosk, for example, simply thought he had done nothing special to deserve his fate, but he had unknowingly destroyed by fighting one of the island's monster bosses a restricted area of the island where a grass called bloodflower was growing. One of the active ingredients extracted from this plant was used in the making of the crystals that enslave the island's animals, but could also be consumed directly to regenerate the vitality lost in the berserk mode. Its regular consumption reinforced the body's tolerance to flinchium, and it was a rare and high-end food in their society. Only Zorians of a status similar to that of the priest had access to this type of treat. It was therefore no surprise that massive means had been deployed to take revenge on this wretched Nosk. Anyway, the main thing now was that the guards and the thralls were too busy to worry about them. The Nosk had never feared the Zorians themselves, only the thralls. The other prisoners who still had an ounce of energy shared the same point of view. In perfect synchronicity, as if they had rehearsed a choreography together thousands of times, the prisoners moved as one body. The chains that hindered their movements and connected them to each other became their new weapons. Multiple chains rattled as they hung on the ground, alerting nearby guards, but it was already too late. Seconds later, those unwary Zorian guards were choking in the arms of those few prisoners. Whether they were Nosk, human, or of another humanoid species, these emaciated participants had a cold and merciless look in their eyes. No matter how much these Zorians struggled and lacerated their skin with their claws, none of them let go. The Zorian warriors, who had reacted in time thanks to the vigilance of their spirit bodies, immediately drew their weapons and rushed to the rescue of their comrades. The weaker prisoners who had neither the intention nor the energy to do anything were forced to join the fight, and in an instant the place of the altar became a battlefield where blood and guts painted a bloody picture. The priest clutched the sacrificial scimitar in his hand with unspeakable fury, but a restless gaze toward the ground and the lava fountain deterred him from rescuing his troops. Only the ancient designer knew where this infernal player had gone, but that did not bode well. If he left the altar, his berserk mode would end and he would become a normal Zorian warrior again. He was a preacher, not a warrior. However, he was not totally helpless, far from it. Regularly, a psychic wave would explode from his body and petrify most of the prisoners on the spot. Those who already had little strength left had already knelt on the ground, a fanatical gleam in their eyes. Normally, at least 90% of the participants would have suffered the same fate, but the priest was too afraid that this human would take advantage of his concentration to make a deadly attack. Because of this, his mental attacks were rather restrained as he had to keep his spirit body deployed at its maximum range in all circumstances. On top of that, as the prisoners moved away from him, the impact of his soul skills on them was reduced. Soon, a few prisoners managed to escape his zone of influence, and the situation degenerated a notch further. In the almost minute it took Jake to reach the second trap above the city, the situation below had already descended into chaos. Many of the prisoners had broken free from their chains by using their jailer's weapons or other techniques of their own and were fighting 2 or 3 Zorians at a time, usually in an unfavorable position. More than 100 prisoners had surrendered to the enemy's soul skills, but the remaining players were holding out despite their physical weakness and undernourishment. As for the lava fountain, the sacrifice of these thralls had been in vain. The lava was still spreading, and those who had blocked it were already completely charred. Forced by the urgency of the situation, the Zorian priest had to give up the protection of the skyscraper thrall to fill the breach. Nonchalantly, the giant monster put his foot on top of the tunnel, and it did the job even though his foot began to sizzle. However, the thrall had indeed become useless. It could no longer move. This was the moment Jake chose to reappear. Chapter 309 Finally Rich. Zorian civilians and guards had fragile bodies, but only in their normal form. As soon as the mutiny had escalated to a battle of this magnitude, they all grabbed the pendant around their necks and changed into their berserk form. None of them approached the majesty or threat level emanating from the Zorian priest, but their fighting prowess in this form was still something no normal players could resist. Every second, 1 or 2 prisoners were mortally wounded at the beginning of their revolt, but those who had survived so far were the cream of the crop among the participants. Strong mind, strong body, and refined fighting skills. By the time Jake's head emerged from the vault overlooking the city, the battle raging beneath him had already found a sort of equilibrium. When he saw the bloodshed and the number of dead Zorians, he almost burst into tears. My points. My precious points. All these dead Zorians were supposed to die because of him. Who were all these fucking opportunists? At a glance, Jake's gaze locked on a few prisoners who were different from the others with very distinct styles. On the one hand, there was Kevin in his werebear appearance, and Kate trying their damn best to make their way out of the city. With their low-key attacks, they had already left the priest's area of influence and were well on their way to success. These two have good instincts. Jake laughed as he watched them run at breakneck speed away from the conflict. The Nosk was also quite a sight in the midst of all these Zorians. Without its dendrites, it was a shadow of its former self, but its physical strength was hard to match. This alien did not have its joints and organs frozen by the cold like the one he had fought, and even with its injuries its performance was still striking. With each punch and kick, a few Zorians were thrown into the air as if they weighed only a few grams. Of course, this alien was in a class of its own. There was another inhuman-looking alien fighting all by himself. A kind of humanoid lizard somehow fused with a horse. Dark mane, brown scales, lizard jaw, herbivorous teeth, round and blunt claws on top, and hooves on the bottom. A farcical combination if ever there was one, but this alien was over 4 meters tall and weighed about a ton. Each of its tail blows were like unstoppable bludgeons. He was the largest participant Jake had encountered in this ordeal so far. A final group of 3 humans had taken command of the rest of the prisoners, and together they were trying to exterminate as many civilians as possible. Obviously, they had triggered the Zorian hunter feat, and were actively trying to collect as many points as possible to improve their final rating while they still could. Most of them had seen 1 or more of their friends being sacrificed and ending up as food, and even though they knew they were not really dead, their hatred for these Zorians was genuine. It was this group that had mainly stolen his points. However, Jake only needed a glance at them to understand that they were doomed. These 3 humans were impressive, but their efforts to hunt down civilians had hindered their evacuation. The thralls responsible for their safety, who until then had ignored these players, had begun to take an interest in them. No doubt they would all die in an instant. Losing interest in their fate, Jake smacked his lips impatiently and focused on the rock plug blocking the lava flow from the magma chamber. Unlike the lava coming up from the depths of the earth, which had to fight gravity, this one was instead driven by it. The lava had already been in place for a long time. All that was left to do was to blow the ceiling of the cave. But this time Jake did not want to create a simple lava flow. He had a better idea. A second later, an explosion sounded in the direction of the vault that made most of the people present, Zorians as prisoners, look up. When the priest recognized the characteristic shimmering of the molten rock, his jaw went slack. He had already mentally prepared for it after the first trap, but it was still a shock to see his worst apprehensions come true. And this time the lava was right above him, ready to pour directly onto the altar. Their bracelets were not like the participants' oracle devices. They couldn't make wishes like the players, just locate them. These bracelets had other useful abilities, such as the power to disrupt the oracle's predictions, but for this kind of situation the device was too limited. Sarah, lying on her back, who without arms or legs on the altar looked like a bloody log, burst out laughing at the sight of the lava clumping above them. Only that son of a bitch Jake could dare to sacrifice her like that, as if she was just a vulgar collateral damage. Regardless, she was still happy. The crazy priest had cut off her legs during that long minute to vent his frustration, and she couldn't wait for it to stop. She avoided further suffering, and at least by getting killed by Jake, she was pretty hopeful that she would be compensated. Why are you laughing? The priest bawled next to her in his demonic form as he hugged his scimitar, trembling with rage and fear. You will be the only one to die? Even though without the altar I will be more vulnerable, I can still run away. How will you escape? Sarah burst out laughing again, convulsing briefly between laughs to spit out some blood. You're too optimistic. I don't know about the other Zorians, but you're dead for sure. On hearing the young woman's wacky voice, the priest frowned. Her conviction had given him a horrible foreboding, and a foreboding among their kind. It was sometimes more reliable than a prediction from the oracle. All of a sudden, the young woman's laughter stopped, her face frozen in a sort of insane grin, and the priest saw through the reflection of her pupils an intense light coming towards them. The Zorian shivered and flew as fast as he could out of the crystal altar, but it was too late. Damn it! These were his last words. Like a garden hose at full power after a thumb was put in front to block its flow, the lava exploded into a multitude of droplets, forming a shower of lava that covered not only the altar, but also the temple and a small part of the city. Sarah had already accepted her death, but a rock in the shape of an upside-down bowl crashed onto her just before the lava rain came. With no arms or legs, her body was completely sheltered inside. The priest had received similar preferential treatment, but the bowl was upright and weighed more than 10 tons. Even without Jake's intervention, the height of the cave was high enough for the projectile to reach a velocity of nearly 200 kilometers per hour. Adding his telekinesis, it was literally a meteor. The priest, who was actively flapping his wings a few dozen meters away from the altar, was hit head-on by the enormous rock. Like an egg against a stone, an unmistakable cracking sound was heard on the battlefield, and so the high priest died, crushed by a stone. The lava rain came soon after, and the corpse under the boulder slowly began to hiss in contact with the molten lava. Had he chosen to withstand this attack physically by remaining on the altar, he might have survived, but he chose to flee. Without his demonic form, he was only a Zorian, somewhat less frail than the others. When the lava rain reached the Zorians and prisoners fighting below, Jake breathed a sigh of relief and closed his eyes to count his points. His Zorian hunter feat's points had begun to skyrocket. It was the first time he had killed so many enemies effortlessly, and it gave him an intense sense of gratification. Still, when he saw his number of player kills rising together at the same rate, he immediately felt awkward. These participants may have been captured like nobodies, but for surviving until now they all had a considerable number of ether points, ranging from a few 100,000 to several million. With the exception of Kevin and Kate, who had fled early on, and the prisoners that managed to break out before ending up charred, everyone present ended up roasted in a shower of molten rock. The cries of agony and rage were powerless to stop this lava rain, and very quickly the voices quieted down and silence returned to the altar square. Only then did Jake reopen his eyes and appeared again on the vault of the cave for all to see. The few Zorians and prisoners still alive who looked up at the culprit then discovered a human with a smug face and eyes filled with joy, as if the massacre that had just taken place had nothing to do with him. Those who were barely hanging on to life died on the spot. Chapter 310, Just Another Zorian. The lava rain was only possible because Jake was using his telekinesis to accurately obstruct the lava flow. The reason he was keeping his distance, looking down on the city from hundreds of feet, was not out of fear, but because he had no choice. If he moved more than 100 meters away, the lava would start pouring normally again. In other words, directly onto the sacrificial altar. Still with the same satisfied smile on his face, Jake remained for several minutes with his arms folded at the top of the cave, contemplating with growing disbelief as his number of ether points climbed along with his position in the player ranking. All the prisoners who had surrendered to the Zorian's spiritual techniques had already lost their free will and had not fled when the lava rain had fallen. More than 100 participants had died without ever having to lift a finger. When Jake put an end to the rain about 5 minutes later, his ether points had finally surpassed 200 million, as had his player rankings. First place, Jake Wilderth, species, human 203,248,994 points, 117 kills. Second place, Krish, species, Krish 191,688,226 points, 316 kills. Third place, Bawopi, species, Nosk 182,387 255 points, 255 kills. 4th place, Hakrasha, species. Jackham 177,634,283 points, 5 kills. 5th place, Krish, species. Krish 125,432,486 points, 193 kills. 6th place, Ruby Hale, species. Human 119,845,569 points, 114 kills. 7th place, Aleph Smith, species. Human 99,231,862 points, 27 kills. 8th place, Fairy Minotas. Human 96,854,323 points, 33 kills. 9th place, Ryo Hayashi. Human 91,564,238 points, 31 kills. 10th place, Inya Velsiel. Human 81,968,661 points, 1 kill. 14th place, Bryce Wilderth. Human 32,064,846 points, 7 kills. 21st place, George Wilderth. Human 10.106, 063 PTS, 3 kills. 49th place, Kevin Wilderth. Human 5.638, 179 PTS, 0 kill. 75th place, Will Hopkins. Human 3,836,796 points, 0 kill. As magical as it may seem, he was now first in the ranking, ahead of Krish and Bawopi, 2 aliens specializing in player killing. He knew the Nosk's temperament and abilities, so such a score was not really a surprise. Jake hadn't been looking at the player ranking closely the last 2 days. On the one hand, because of the mission, on the other hand, because of his injuries. He was too busy thinking about how to destroy this city to get a maximum of points. He consulted it regularly to check how his companions were doing, as well as to find out how many participants were still in the race. He would also occasionally take a quick look at the top of the ranking, but his time was too precious to squander it admiring those above him. In any case, he had memorized the name of each participant with his photographic memory, and he could easily recall their past rankings by comparing the previous mental images in his mind. In spite of the joy and apprehension he felt at the prospect of being so suddenly first in the rankings, it had also made him pay more attention to his more direct competitors. And, to say the least, the situation had changed in the last few hours. The top 7 was relatively stable. Jackham, whom he had never met, had given way to the Krish and the Nosk, but the scores were fairly close. This player was all the more impressive as its kill count was low. Gaining points on its own meant relying on the feats and mission rewards. Jake wasn't even sure if he could get that many points in a year, and this alien had done it in less than 2 months. He couldn't help but be curious about the method this alien was using to score so many points. The other surprise, of course, was Enya. Jake was one of his comrades. Just like Will, he monitored her ranking quite regularly. Just the day before, she was only at the 89th place, behind Will and Sarah. After her sister's elimination, he thought she would soon give up, but he was wrong. The fact that she had a kill now, and that the Nosk occupying this place in the ranking previously had disappeared hinted clearly at the course of events. By contrast, Jake didn't give a damn about the status of his cousins in general, and seeing that Bryce, George, and Kevin were all in the top 50 was not necessarily good news. They shared the same last name, and their recent rise to prominence had certainly already drawn attention to them. Maybe even those Nosks and Krish's freaks had already targeted them. But as Jake quickly checked on his other companions like Sarah, Tim, Lily, Kate, and the 2 Zewids, he noticed that something was wrong. Sarah's name in the rankings was nowhere to be found. She should normally have been ranked around 50th place. Jake, who had just put an end to the lava rain, then looked down towards the altar, and when he saw the giant stone bowl covering the young woman below him, his ecstatic face suddenly became horrified. Don't tell me that. Fuck. Now that the lava rain was over, a cascade of lava was pouring directly onto the altar, submerging the stone bowl almost entirely. In contact with the molten rock, which was between 700 and 1,200 degrees Celsius, the interior of the stone bowl had long since turned into a furnace. In panic, and not daring to believe that he could have made such a blunder, Jake jumped straight down to the altar. With a telekinetic blast, he pushed all the lava away from the giant crystal, forming a spherical force field around it. He didn't forget to emit a good dose of ultraviolet light to counter the flinchium energy either, but there was so much half-cooled lava on it that it was useless. By the time Jake waded through the molten rock towards the rock bowl covering the young woman, he had already lost all hope. The player ranking could not be wrong. For him, this heat was nothing, hardly worse than a slightly hot summer day. But for a woman like Sarah, it was hell. Unconsciously, by dint of being so close to the lava, he had almost convinced himself that such heat was tolerable for everyone to eye in the heat of the action. The sad reality had completely slipped from his mind. Having to take responsibility, Jake inhaled deeply and lifted the rock with his telekinesis, unveiling the young blonde woman underneath. Or rather, what was left of her. A perfect steam cooking at over 500 degrees Celsius. Sarah already had no arms, no legs, and now she really looked like a log that had spent the night in a fireplace. When Jake had lifted the lid, a cloud of steam had immediately escaped, as when opening a pressure cooker, leaving only a charred and unrecognizable corpse as the only evidence of Sarah's passage on this island. Holy shit, Jake stammered with a pale face. He had really screwed up big time on this one. Just thinking about Sarah's reaction when she would see him again at the red cube, he already had a headache. Slowly steaming to death in a lava oven was probably even more painful than being dismembered. Deep down he was horrified and had no idea how Sarah would behave with him after that. If she hated him, it would be perfectly understandable. Stop feeling guilty. What's done is done. There's nothing you can do to change that. At worst, you'll compensate her properly when you get back. She commented in an exasperated tone. Even in the data she had access to, friendly fire between comrades was not so rare. It was much better for this to happen during the second ordeal, where one could revive, than at the fifth ordeal, where death was final. Who are you? Jake was about to answer her, when a deep, parched voice exploded behind him with enough power to shake the walls of the cave. The buildings most damaged by the lava rain did not hold up and crumbled instantly. Alerted, Jake spun around as he flew high into the air in one big burst. In less than a second, he had reached back the vault of the cave, a few meters away from the lava cascade. His gaze was now focused on the owner of this voice. To his surprise, it belonged to the skyscraper-sized Zorian thrall. All along the altercation, the giant monster had remained motionless and silent, its foot in charge of plugging the lava fountain, not having moved since the beginning. Seeing two ruby eyes the size of truck wheels staring at him with curiosity, Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. Surprisingly, he felt no hostility from the monster. There's no need to be so wary. The thrall chuckled while shaking the earth again. It's a shame my tribe was so miserably wiped out, but just like you, they're players in their own way. Even leaving this thrall to them, they were unable to save themselves. Their death is well-deserved. In the same way that you killed those prisoners without hesitation, I don't care about their lives. Those who were holed up here underground were nothing but losers, outcasts among my kind. Who are you? Jake asked with furrowed brows. The tone of this thrall was a little bit off, almost friendly. Just another Zorian, but it doesn't matter. Sigh, time's already up. I hope we meet again. The giant monster answered solemnly. At that moment, the reddish color in its pupils was replaced by a multicolored shimmer of light, and the huge flinchium stone around its neck disintegrated. After that, the presence was gone, and the thrall collapsed to the ground, triggering a small earthquake. The seemingly invincible monster was dead. Chapter 3:11 Greed. When the giant thrall collapsed dead flat on the ground, raising a gust of dust and debris, the foot that was blocking the lava fountain was inevitably moved. A geyser of molten rock, like an overflowing manhole cover, began pouring lava once more into the altar square filled with corpses that once hosted the Zorian crowd. Jake hadn't really been able to question the identity of the Zorian controlling the thrall when he heard footsteps and yelling coming toward him. When he turned his head behind him with a raised eyebrow, he recognized the few surviving prisoners who had managed to escape his lava rain. With their half-anxious, half-excited expressions, Jake had no trouble understanding their intentions. The Nosk seemed to want to challenge him to a one-on-one combat. In this respect, it was no different from the one he had faced during the blizzard. The lizard horse alien seemed to be interested in the thralls' charred bodies, and a stream of saliva flowed non-stop from his half-open jaw. On the other hand, the three humans who had taken command of the prisoners and their few acolytes watched him with unabashed greed. Some of their minions seemed hesitant, and their hands trembled slightly as they clutched the Zorian weapons they had stolen close to them. Jake expected Kevin and Kate to come back once the battle was over, but they had apparently run away with no concern. Just the opposite of these free prisoners who were now trying to fish in troubled waters. "Thank you for your help," one of the three leaders blurted out in English with a falsely grateful smile. He was a middle-aged man with pale skin and a full red beard. He had a strong Scottish accent. Jake peered into the individual's eyes, but remained silent. He wanted to see how shamelessly this man could behave. Indeed, when the former prisoner took note of his mutism, he felt humiliated inside, but he tried not to show it on his face. "I'll be frank. By being imprisoned here, we have all lost a lot. Beneath the altar is their stock of flintium and the famous liquid metal used to make our bracelets, which they extracted in previous sacrifices. If it's not too much to ask, we want a share of the booty." On the surface, the request seemed polite, but this man's perfidious look betrayed his true intentions. Jake couldn't understand why these humans weren't afraid of him. He had seen what they were capable of, and although they were not so bad, they were not a threat to him. Did they really think that Nosk and the other alien would help them? In fact, that's exactly what they thought. They didn't know what method Jake had used to trigger such a lava shower, but for them it could only be a long-term plan planned well in advance. It was inconceivable to them that a player just like them could exterminate an entire Zorian tribe without shedding a single drop of sweat. For these three leaders, their capture was only the consequence of a terrible string of bad luck. The proof was that they had no trouble getting free when the opportunity presented itself. If they were the ones who had been sacrificed instead of Sarah, they would undoubtedly have tried something, with or without Jake's intervention. Moreover, after those few days in captivity, they had a good understanding of the character of the other two aliens. The Nosk spoke little, but lived only for honor. It did not fear the sacrifice, because each time the priest would give the sacrifice the chance to fight. They all failed because their bodies could not endure the pure energy of the altar, but it was different. A Nosk, even a weakened one, could easily endure such a berserk form for a long minute. Even if they were then defeated and sacrificed by the Zorian priest, it was not a dishonorable death. The other alien did not have the same concerns and was primarily motivated by food. The placid character of a herbivore combined with the appetite of a carnivore. An odd combination, but one that proved deadly if one clashed with its desires. In this precise context, it turned out that this alien, whom the prisoners knew as Wurching, enjoyed the smell and taste of the thralls. It was this rampant gluttony that had provoked the tribe's anger and led to its capture. This alien had a brain the size of an apple despite its great height. Thanks to the ether of intelligence, the intellect of this species rivaled that of a human child. These humans did not know what this alien was doing in an ordeal reserved for the humanoid species, but they were confident that they could exploit its stupidity. All they had to do was convince it that Jake refused to share the thralls' corpses. Convinced of their hostile intentions, Jake nonchalantly scrutinized the expressions of the other two human leaders along with the armed prisoners behind them without finding any dissonance in their attitudes. This group of survivors seemed to share the same agenda. In total, there were 11 of them, counting the Nosk and Wurching, which was less than the total number of survivors. Not counting Kevin and Kate, those who did not want to participate in what was to follow had already fled. Seeing their confidence, Jake suddenly let out a small chuckle of disdain. When he looked down on these humans, he made no secret of his contempt for them. Finally, he nodded his head towards the Nosk and said calmly, "I accept the duel. Just let me finish with them." The Nosk, who hadn't uttered a word until now, bowed slightly, placing one hand against his chest as a sign of acceptance. Then Jake let out another derisive sneer and turned towards the lizard. With Crunch and his gang of felines, he was already used to animals. Communicating his intentions telepathically with the help of images and sensation was already possible before this ordeal. With his recent progress, it was now ridiculously simple. His spirit body connected with the Wurching's spirit body, and after some telepathic fluctuations, the lizard let out a joyful roar before rushing towards the skyscraper-sized corpse of the thrall, licking its lips with delight. Seeing their two trump cards leave them with a few words of the human in front of them, the faces of the three humans instantly crumpled. Flee. It was the only idea they could think of right now. These players were collaborating together by force of circumstance, but none of them knew each other before their capture. One of the lackeys in the rear ran away frantically without any concern for the fate of his comrades, and that was the signal that started the rout. Seconds later, all the humans, including the three leaders, were scurrying like madmen in the opposite direction of the temple. Unfortunately for them, Jake was not a forgiving man. Wordlessly, his two hands grasped the void in front of him, and a sphere of lava several meters in diameter was immediately torn from the rapidly forming pool of lava around the fountain. Then, without warning, Jake took off with his weapon of mass destruction. Like a missile, the Murtharian and his projectile split the air, generating a supersonic shock wave, and overtook the fugitives in an instant. Once within range, Jake fragmented the lava sphere into smaller projectiles corresponding to the number of targets and fired. As if 9 trebuchets had just been triggered at the same time, 9 shooting stars passed through the city as fast as a flash and struck their intended targets. All 6 minions died instantly, not because of the heat of the lava, but because of the tremendous momentum of these projectiles. The molten rock remained as heavy as any boulder, and at that speed it was even more lethal than a shot of heavy artillery. The other 3 survived the impact thanks to their shadow guide, but this provoked their pursuer. To increase their luck, the 3 humans had wanted to separate in different directions, but instead had stayed close together. This was one of the paradoxes of the shadow guide. Normally, dispersing would have allowed at least 2 of them to survive, but because of the shadow guide, the one who was doomed knew that it would cause his loss. Consequently, his logical decision was not to separate from his companions. By recalibrating the predictions, the 3 fugitives found themselves stuck together, unable to take any initiative. As a result, Jake caught them without too much difficulty with an amused face, and with a snap of his fingers, the ground under their feet liquefied and wrapped them up tightly like a big coat. When the rock re-solidified, the 3 of them were neck deep in the rock. "Please, this is a misunderstanding," the Scotsman begged, sweating profusely, his face red and congested by the rock blocking his breathing. The pleas of the other 2 leaders resounded immediately afterwards, but Jake ignored their complaints. If they had been on B842 or in the 5th ordeal, he might have hesitated, but knowing that they would revive soon after, he felt no remorse or hesitation. 3 mental arrows followed by a telekinetic strike struck the bodies of the 3 former prisoners, and their brains exploded instantly. He didn't know what their abilities and ether skills were, but it made no difference. They were like lambs facing a wolf. A moment later, Jake was back at the altar, and he settled his duel against the Nosk with a few strokes of his giant sword. The alien was strong, but unfortunately too weakened. These victories consolidated his first place in the rankings by bringing his score over 215 points. "Thank you," the Nosk murmured with gratitude in a long rattle as its head rolled on the ground. Finally in peace, Jake let Wurching feast on its own corner and went in search of the booty that had driven all those prisoners out of their minds. Chapter 3:12 Morality. Before searching the temple, and now that Jake no longer had to watch his back, he could at last take a look at the dead bodies around him. After examining the charred body of the Zorian priest and the bodies of several other guards, he was able to ascertain with great regret that their bracelets were irretrievable. Unlike the participants' oracle devices, the latter had not disappeared, but his own bracelet seemed not to care, as if these scraps of inert metal had nothing substantial enough to deserve to be assimilated. Intuitively, Jake thought this was odd, but not necessarily absurd. In his own opinion, the metallic liquid in his bracelet was not just metal, but more likely a multitude of nanorobots, or at least something capable of supporting a complex program. If it was really just metal, the etheric code of the material must have had unique properties. When he had absorbed another player's bracelet during his first ordeal, the metal had been used to upgrade his own oracle device. At the time, he felt it had more to do with the energy contained in the metal than the data contained inside. Clearly, his bracelet seemed to be able to make use of this liquid metal regardless of its original state. In other words, if absorption of these Zorian bracelets was not possible, the most likely reason was that the precious metal inside had already vanished. These ornaments remaining visible after their deaths were just perfectly normal jewelry and accessories. Jake then took a look at the corpses of the participants, but as expected, he found nothing interesting on them. Some people might have thought that he had been cruel in eliminating them all without showing any remorse, but he felt that he had been merciful. Those prisoners who had surrendered to the Zorian's mind techniques were already at the end of their rope and could not have lasted any longer with or without his intervention. After all, the Phantom Sanctuary could not proceed with its descent as long as there were still more than 100 players in the running. As for those who had thanked his act of indirect rescue with boundless and willfully malicious greed, they deserved even more to die. If Jake was a ruthless monster, he should have dismembered them alive to absorb their bracelets. On this point, Jake was still too candid and still suffering from his habits on Earth. He could kill effortlessly when his immediate or future survival was threatened because it didn't conflict with the moral standards he had been taught. But when it came to killing out of sheer selfishness, he felt a certain reluctance. In this case, he knew he should not have hesitated. These participants had not hesitated to attack him, and he should have been more decisive than that. Killing them was far too generous a retaliation. "Next time, I won't hesitate," Jake mumbled, clenching his fists. His mumble caught Werching's attention, but seeing that it was his benefactor, the lizard quickly lost interest in him and returned to munching on the thrall in front of him with ravenous appetite. By seeing him doubting, his AI's hologram materialized in front of him. "As long as you're aware of it, that's all that matters," she reassured him with a tired tone as if she had already experienced all the vicissitudes of life. Unconsciously, you still justify your murders by telling yourself that these ordeals are not really reality, even though you know that this is not the case. You killed all these creatures, dinosaurs, and even Zorians without hesitation because they are not of the same species as you and you were profiting from their death. They brought you food, fur, materials, or ether. Their death had meaning. Killing a human for money, resources, or ether is not fundamentally different. By giving a different importance to human life, you are acting out of speciesism. Don't judge life that way and don't be hypocritical. You don't really feel guilty about killing these humans, because deep down you know that they are not really dead. It is a mistake to think like that, which sooner or later will lead you to failure. In 3 ordeals, and maybe even as soon as you wander around on B842, you will have to kill other Earthlings to guarantee your own interests. In a world at peace, you might wonder about this moral code that encourages the emergence of sociopaths. But believe me, if you want to survive to the end, kindness will get you nowhere. Don't kill for no reason. But if you have a solid reason, no matter how futile, you don't have to hesitate. Jake stiffened when he heard she's last words. It was the first time he had ever heard such ruthless words come out of her mouth. It was only then that he fully realized that his Oracle AI was not the duplicate consciousness of a mere young woman, but the mind of a warrior who probably had more blood on her hands than all the Zorians in this city. Killing a human or wringing the neck of a chicken probably made no difference to her. "I'll remember that," he finally answered after a few seconds of silence. What else could he say? Deep down, even if he didn't completely agree, he had already unconsciously begun to compromise for future instances where such a situation would arise. He absolutely had to toughen up. It was not enough to depend on the confidence conferred by the character traits of his bloodline. Exhaling a deep breath of hot air, he gave both his cheeks a vigorous slap to refocus his mind on reality and strode toward the temple. He had already scanned the catacombs beneath the altar without finding any access. Of course, he had tried to simply pull up the liquid metal that had flowed into the crevices using his telekinesis, but the catacombs were simply too deep. Even by extending his spirit body more than 100 meters deep, he had not been able to find any sign of this precious resource. However, just as when he had tried to go from underneath, the walls of an almost indestructible vault prevented him from making his way through. As a result of his unsuccessful attempts, Jake was forced to look for another way. The temple was the most promising option. The only thing that bothered him about the temple was the opaque darkness inside, which seemed to catch all the light without letting anything out. When he had finished climbing the few steps leading up to the large, dark arcade without a doorway, a warm draft of air blew abruptly from the depths of the temple. This level of wind and heat was nothing to him, but a normal human probably could not have stood still. Vigilant, Jake unhesitatingly activated the Murtarian trance and sight before entering the monument. As he stepped into the hall, he felt like he was being sucked into a black hole, but after a few meters he realized that the building wasn't so ghastly. The walls were indeed coated with a material that absorbed 100% of the light emitted, but otherwise the hall was empty. To be honest, from his spirit body's feedback, the building looked more like a kind of barn where the Zorian thralls were certainly crowded together most of the time. The permanent darkness inside was simply the environment these creatures preferred. The temple was much larger than it appeared from the outside, but being devoid of furniture, he quickly found a trap door in the center of the only room and immediately blew it out of the way with a waving gesture. A mental scan allowed him to recognize the same type of catacombs as the one under the altar. Delighted to find that it was so simple, Jake leapt into the hole without hesitation. He fell for about 5 seconds before hitting the bottom. He had noticed a ladder against one of the walls during his fall, but the priest could fly in his berserk form, so it was probably not in use. Once down, he scanned his surroundings again and calmly headed in a direction. With its multiple steel galleries and lack of light, this labyrinth would have been a nightmare for a normal human, but for Jake it was as simple as a walk in his own garden. The few traps present were not able to overcome the telekinetic force field erected around him, while he could easily find his way around thanks to his spirit body, which now had a relatively high range. In an instant he arrived in a room that he estimated would be right under the altar. He knew that he had arrived at his destination, because an armored safe door was now blocking his path. Naturally, he tried to open it by force, but the thick armored door did not move an inch. Becoming impatient, Jake started scanning the door for a clue, but the surface of the obstacle was perfectly smooth and shiny. He saw no code system, lock, or other identification device. Not finding a solution even with his present intelligence and perception, he was forced to abandon the soft method. At first, he gave the metal door a big punch that shook the walls of the catacombs, but the door held firm. Second, he punched again, adding telekinesis for more impact and speed, but with no more success. Thirdly, he concentrated his ether of strength, agility, and constitution in his right arm for even more power, and only then a slight indentation of 1 millimeter appeared on the surface of the plating. But Jake's face darkened instead of rejoicing when he saw this meager achievement. His mental scan was formal. This door was several meters thick. Even if he punched it non-stop without taking a break, this vault would still be in one piece the next morning. The alloy making up the door and the walls of the safe appeared to be remarkably ductile. If he struck like this, he might just crush what was inside like a crushed can. The creator of this chest knew what he was doing when he designed this door. Helpless, he had to consider other solutions. Chapter 313 Soul Spell. Since brute force didn't work, Jake readily tried another method, and it turned out to be the right choice. Determined, he released the claw from one of his index fingers and directed the gray ether from his other claws and fangs to that claw. The claw, which he could now extend up to 20 centimeters thanks to the evolution of his bloodline, now seemed to be wrapped in a ghostly grayish light sheath. Next, his lava veins and his entire body began to glow with intense heat. Calmly, he concentrated all this heat towards this single claw, and very quickly it began to shine as bright as a mini sun. The radiant heat of his claw was such that his own skin was somewhat itchy just by coming into contact with the heated air. Right now, he wouldn't have dared to touch his own claw without a thick layer of constitution ether for protection. Finally ready, he placed the tip of his index finger against the armored door and started scribbling with his claw as if he was trying to write something onto the door. The metal held firm and there was no sizzling or burning sound, but after his claw moved past, a fiery red furrow remained in its wake. Moreover, he had felt almost no resistance. This method worked. Since the blowtorch or plasma claw method was effective, the rest of the process went off without a hitch. He patiently pressed his claw into the thick metal plating, and when the metal started to soften and melt, he slid his finger along the structure to spread the damage. The alloy making up this door was ridiculously resilient, but it also had a melting point. After about an hour, the armored door had been reduced to a glowing sludge-like state, reminiscent of the magma pouring down just above him. With an additional ram strike using all his weight, the armored door collapsed with a screeching rusty sound. Jake stepped over the puddle of molten metal with a small leap and was finally able to discover the treasure for which such a safe had been created. To be honest, the room was pretty empty, about 20 square meters. Had it not been for a sort of shelf full of old grimoires in a corner and a stone pedestal in the center topped by a circular table, the room would have been completely empty. Containing his disappointment, Jake moved cautiously toward the center table with a twinkle in his eye. Inspecting the stone furniture from all angles, he noticed that the base was rooted in the ground. The surface of the table was relatively smooth, like polished black marble. Surprisingly, his spirit body was unable to perceive what was inside, but he would have bet his life that what he was looking for was there. He found some sort of switch under the stone cabinet, but nothing else. Before activating it, he first studied the room from top to bottom and was immediately reassured when the feedback from his spirit body confirmed that he had not made all those efforts in vain. Looking up at the ceiling, Jake materialized some light with his hand, which allowed him to recognize the grooves and furrows through which the metallic liquid extracted from the participants had trickled down under the altar. The network of inscriptions and carvings that had purified the altar's energy seemed to stretch all the way to the table in the center. Having already found the switch hidden under the table, Jake activated it with his telekinesis, and the smooth table surface quickly warped to form a series of boxes reminiscent of the keys of a keyboard. While testing a few buttons, a three-dimensional light hologram filled with unknown symbols appeared in front of him, and he couldn't help but growl in frustration when he realized that he didn't recognize a single one. It was not Oriclean, but a different language, probably the native language of the Zorians. Moreover, these symbols were changing and frequently switched from one form to another, obeying mysterious laws he didn't know anything about. And yet these symbols were not totally unknown to him, but they were also different from those he knew. Before he could check his assumptions, Shi's hologram appeared at his sides with a pensive expression. "They are soul ether runes," she explained after a while when she saw his confusion. "Your novice ether manipulation manual did not cover these runes. It's too advanced for now. The soul glyphs you received are made up of similar runes, my artificial consciousness as well. Once your soul and spirit body exists in an etheric form, the information of your memories, thoughts, and characteristics are contained in such soul ether runes. Each new thought or memory automatically generates new runes, since the ether and your spirit are always in perpetual motion. We all behave in a certain way according to our education, mood, and past experiences, and all this can be read in these runes. Like a computer program that would define how we function, but instead of relying on neural networks and our hormones, the soul ether runes take care of that. It means that the soul glyphs I received as a reward have somehow affected the person I am, or at least that such glyphs can do that." Jake extrapolated with a disturbed look on his face. "Right." She nodded. "The ones you've received have nothing but benefits, but they add to the weight of your soul, so to speak. If you compare the human mind to a computer's operating system, you can install all kinds of software on it, change the source code of the system itself, or even put a virus in it. It is also possible to fill your mind to saturation like a computer crashing because it can't run a game. The soul and all these types of manipulations are the Zorian's specialty. Of course, those you faced were too young or incompetent to perform this." Jake was chilled to think that by accepting these soul glyphs, he may have willingly let in a mental virus capable of lobotomizing him from within. "Don't worry, the Oracle wouldn't let that happen." She reassured him with an intangible pat on the shoulder, but that only made him more gloomy. If there was one thing Jake doubted in terms of efficiency and transparency, it was the Oracle system. In this ordeal alone, he had been nearly eliminated several times because of its unreliability. While he was languishing, the multitude of holographic symbols continued to whirl in front of him by repeating non-stop the same patterns by dint of observing them. Jake noticed that there seemed to be spaces appearing sometimes in the middle of all these symbols. Some of them were missing. "So this is how they check their identity," Jake whispered, stroking his chin. Jake hadn't formed his ether core yet, but with his bloodline evolution and all his training, he was confident that he could reproduce some of these ether runes. The hologram in front of him was several meters wide. To create runes of this size required little effort. After having observed at length the hologram in front of him, Jake's keen perception finally identified a certain number of ether runes, and his memory and calculation powers did the rest. Subconsciously, he began to visualize the hologram with his own spirit, and the ether circulating in his spirit body began to reproduce the ether runes in front of him by mimicry. The closer he came to a perfect execution, the more he felt his mood changing. With each symbol he was able to reproduce, he got a little closer to the goal, and his aura changed accordingly. Then suddenly, when the whole picture and the thousands of runes were completed, he felt like a trigger in his mind, and intense killing intent erupted from the depths of his soul. His fangs and claws lengthened, and for a brief moment, he vaguely perceived the ether composing the molten metal of the armored door as if it was under his control, just like rock or earth. It was an ability that his Myrmidian bloodline did not yet have, and despite his desire to kill, his lucidity was intact. "I understand what it is," she exclaimed with a confident voice. "These are the soul ether runes contained within the Flinchium's energy. Only a fraction, but it was enough to create such an effect. The Zorians of Chaos are what they are because they have mastered a soul spell. A useless spell, though." Jake sighed as he returned to normal with an exhausted face. As soon as he had paid heed to She's words and was distracted, the ether pattern he had visualized with his spirit body had naturally dissipated. Although the effects were incredible, the drawbacks were not negligible either. In a few seconds of experimentation, he had just lost almost 3 kilos, and his mind was tired, as if he had just pulled 2 sleepless nights in a row. Not to mention the fact that fighting while maintaining such a stable ether structure was currently impossible for him. For now, using the energy of a red soul stone was still better. The good news, however, was that as soon as he managed to perform the soul spell, a gear noise was heard, and the round surface of the table had suddenly tilted to the side, revealing his precious haul. When Jake saw the astronomical amount of metallic liquid inside, his eyes bulged instantly out of sheer surprise. It was just beyond his wildest dreams. The tank starting well below the table, there was enough metallic liquid to fill a small swimming pool. Jake could barely imagine how many players had been sacrificed here over the past few years. A single ordeal was not enough to create that kind of accumulation. Chapter 314, Oracle Device Upgrade. The first question that came to his mind at that time was why all this liquid metal had not been used. Was the Zorian priest unable to perform the incomplete soul spell displayed by the hologram? On closer examination, Jake found this hypothesis less and less absurd. These Zorians possessed incredible soul skills and a superior mind to most players, but from the beginning they had shown no truly unique expertise in ether manipulation. From the priest, to the guards, to the civilians, the mental techniques employed were much the same. Only their power differed, which could be explained by the difference in their stats as well as the density of their spirit body. Their methods of subduing their enemies were relatively diverse, ranging from mental domination to the very manipulation of the enemy's emotions and desires. These techniques could be straightforward like the killing intent of their berserk mode, or insidious like the invisible aura of charisma pulsing forth from the priest's speeches. Yet these techniques were so complex that Jake was unable to reproduce them, only to defend himself from them with great difficulty. It seemed highly unlikely to him that these Zorians were that much more talented than he was. Therefore, the only conclusion was that just like him with his Myrtharian skills, they were using their bloodline to accomplish all these feats. This kind of mental attacks were as natural to them as breathing or walking, and their talent had little to do with it. In this context, it would not be at all surprising if the priest himself remained unable to perform this soul spell. After all, even Jake was barely able to do it after memorizing all the ether runes from his manual and having strived to increase control over his own ether over the previous 2 months. However, what was even more confusing was that no Zorians had managed to do so during all that time. This was evidenced by the liquid that had accumulated through all these sacrifices. But if the priest was not benefiting from these sacrifices, then why was he working so hard to continue this barbaric practice? Had someone ordered him to do so, or was it part of a tradition that these Zorians were required to maintain? Whatever it was, it didn't matter. What mattered now was that all this metal belonged to him. Not quite sure how to retrieve all that metal, Jake grabbed the void in front of him, and an invisible force field captured the equivalent of a pot of liquid metal, just like a fishing net. Patiently, he pulled his catch up to his face. Then, seeing the lifeless aspect of the liquefied alloy, he used the scan of his bracelet to try to get some data out of it. A mysterious alloy that makes up the bracelets given to the living beings of the mirror universe by the Oracle. When he saw the report, Jake snorted with contempt. He should have expected it. If it was possible to find out where this alloy came from and how to make it, everyone would have tried to get their hands on it. There was of course the possibility that his Oracle rank was insufficient to access this information, but it was still frustrating. I don't know more about it. She immediately excused herself when she felt the question coming up. HMFF. He should have known. He knew she had nothing to do with it, but this Oracle system was really too unreliable. Sometimes it motivated him to work his way up the ladder as quickly as possible, but most of the time he was so repulsed by it that he wanted to get rid of his bracelet by any means available so he wouldn't have that sort of Damocles on his neck. Since the scan was useless, Jake then just absorbed the liquid alloy in front of him. Based on his past experience, he simply materialized his bracelet and dipped his arm into the liquid alloy in front of him. Instantly, as if a suction mechanism had just been activated, a kind of mini whirlpool appeared above his bracelet, and the liquid was sucked inside, swirling faster and faster as if someone had just flushed a toilet. It was different from his first experience where the metal had passively crept into his bracelet before disappearing completely. Maybe the amount of metal to be absorbed explained that, or maybe the improvement of his Oracle rank and the capabilities of his bracelet had something to do with it. At the time, he was only rank 2. In other words, nothing much. After a few tens of seconds, the liquid had been completely absorbed. Jake should have been ecstatic, but now he was displaying a rather dark and indignant expression. His right arm, where he was wearing his bracelet, was shaking slightly, and a trickle of cold sweat was flowing from his forehead, indicating the intense effort he was making to keep his right arm stretched out in front of him. Ugh, don't tell me that my bracelet now weighs as much as all that liquid metal? Jake grumbled in frustration. It was a rhetorical question. He knew it was the truth, or his arm wouldn't have become so heavy. A glance at his Oracle device data told him that this was indeed the sad reality. Intermediate grade. Weight: 848 kilograms. Oracle features. Status: no change. Guidance: computing capacities are increased. Can improve the performance of the Shadow Guide as well as the Oracle AI when access to the Oracle system's main network is impossible or fails. Ether vision: no change. Logging, mapping: no change. Scan LVL3. Range 50m equals /U003 E2200M. Auto-densification, new skill, allows the bracelet to keep the same size regardless of its mass. Passive ether absorption from the atmosphere equals ether density 100/day. In this world, 40/day compared to 0.4/day before. Oracle skill slots remaining, 6. Ether encoding slots remaining, 22. The changes were not obvious, but those that did occur were impressive enough to completely change his impression about his bracelet. The scan in particular now had a range that was interesting enough to be life-saving in situations where previously he would have been completely blind. Scanning had the merit of being a relatively neutral technology. A complex ether code produced a specific wave that Jake interpreted literally as the bracelet's spirit body. The detailed report came from the Oracle system databases, but she and Jake were also free to access the feedback from the scan itself. Detecting players with a higher Oracle rank than his was now possible. Of course, the farther he wanted to scan, the more ether it would cost him, but it was still an interesting trump card. A scan at maximum range required 10,000 ether points. It wasn't that much with his new fortune, but it could quickly bankrupt him if he abused it. That was to be reserved for exceptional circumstances. Communicating with allies or any evolvers in the area was also worthwhile, since the communication range was 10 times greater than the scanning range. In the past, it was limited to 500 meters, and this function had been completely neglected. In fact, such a distance could be covered in a few seconds by the current Jake. Alas, the bracelet was just too heavy. Jake really wanted to absorb all this metal, but he was afraid that he would end up unable to move if a single pot weighed more than 800 kilos. The density of this alloy was close to that of gold. On the other hand, he didn't want to leave anything behind. He was convinced that this amount of metal was extremely valuable and that some very high-level players had never seen so much of it before. Improving the Oracle rank did increase the energy levels of the bracelet, but it was impossible for a remote energy transfer to match such a mass of liquid alloy, at least not in Oracle ranks close to his. In addition to the horrendously excessive weight, Jake also had another regret. There was no ether at all. The ether contained by all these bracelets must have dissipated after all this time in this liquid form. She explained succinctly with a tone of condolence. The ether storage is a bracelet's ability. Without the bracelet, the contained energy can only be dispersed. I know, but it's still depressing. Jake grimaced as he repeatedly flexed and stretched his arm as if he was working his biceps with a dumbbell. After repeating the same movement a number of times, his biceps had become congested due to the weight of the bracelet, but he had made up his mind. Eshi, do you think it's a good idea if I absorb all this metal and give up the ordeal? Jake asked for his AI's opinion with sincerity. Her experience in the matter was still considerably superior to his own. He had thought about it, and selling the excess metal to the Oracle store or other evolvers could certainly fetch him a fortune, even if he got ripped off. It could be his seed money to develop his own floating island and Etherist laboratory. She didn't respond immediately, which reinforced his belief that the answer wasn't that simple. Even his AI was not entirely sure about it. After a while, she said tentatively, "First, you can distribute the absorbed metal evenly throughout your body. It will make wearing the bracelet easier. I don't have a clear answer to your question, but I'm sure that such an amount of alloy is priceless. Even in the mirror universe, the materials making up the bracelet are a valuable resource with a price, but no market. On the other hand, if you take all this metal, you will die instantly. There is too much of it. It's just too heavy. Dying in an ordeal always affects the final score, even more if it's suicide. If you can avoid it, it's better. Remember that if it happened in the fifth ordeal, it would indeed be suicide. It is better to start good habits now." Jake nodded unconsciously as he acknowledged She's words of wisdom. Preserving his life above all else was common sense, even though he would not actually die. He could not predict how suicide would affect his future rating. In that case, he would absorb as much metal as he could without compromising his survival. And he did exactly that in the hours that followed. By the time Jake left the catacombs a few hours later, he had become so heavy that calling it a human tank would not have been overkill. Chapter 315, Familiar Aura. Pant. Clung to a ladder in the dark, a man of imposing build was currently huffing and puffing on the verge of asphyxiation. His muscles were shaking and his skin was red from congestion. Regularly, the sound of drops of sweat hitting the ground 100 meters below could be heard. Right now, Jake almost regretted having his eyes bigger than his belly. When he had absorbed all this liquid metal, he was far from imagining the ordeal it would be just to get to the surface. When he had tried to move through the rock with his powers, he had almost sunk like a rock to the Earth's core or whatever was at the bottom of the asteroid, or that sanctuary bubble. If the catacombs were not isolated by a thick layer of metal, he would probably have disappeared into the depths of the Earth forever. Coming to the surface had required him to use all his strength and commitment, but physical force alone had not been enough. To be able to move more than a few steps, he had to combine his strength with the full power of his telekinesis, and only then, after several hours of hell, did he finally see the top of the ladder. After a few more minutes of struggling against all the metal within him and the pull of gravity, Jake finally made it to the temple hall. The catacombs were finally behind him, or rather, below him. Jake lay prostrate on all fours for a long time before recovering his full breath, and only then was he able to stand up again with some difficulty. "Finally, I'm out." Jake almost burst into tears when he saw the warm light waiting for him outside the temple. As if hypnotized, Jake walked step by step toward the temple exit, each step fracturing the rock beneath him as his feet sank 10 centimeters into the ground. A few hours earlier, Jake had not been able to absorb all of it, but the amount of metal currently on him was outrageous. Even with this world's ether density, Jake could lift a maximum load of about 12.5 tons. If he was on Earth, 50 tons would have been his limit. Of course, this was his maximum load, and even if his constitution and vitality were his forte, moving around with such a load on him was unrealistic. It was only with the help of his telekinesis, whose effective force was 4 to 8 times his actual physical strength, that he was able to go so far. At that very moment, Jake weighed about 30 tons, a weight that his body could not support, but which was not enough to kill him if he decided to let go and lie down on the floor to rest his mind and muscles. After all, he was still quite tough with his stone skin. That was about a quarter of the liquid alloy pool in the vault. This metal was just too heavy. If Jake could, he would have absorbed it all, but according to she, it would have become dangerous for him. Maybe he wouldn't have died, but he would have become a sitting duck stuck in those catacombs until he died or the ordeal ended. To tell the truth, so as not to waste anything, Jake had even tried to eat the rest. That's why he now had a metal marble the size of his fist lodged in his stomach. Even after several hours of strenuous activity, the liquid alloy showed no signs of digestion. Jake had never been able to intentionally make himself vomit and was not in pain, so he had decided to live with it. However, this had inevitably put an end to his gluttonous ambitions. As a result, Jake had to give up all that metal, and that was consumed with regret and frustration that he had made it back here. Yet, despite the suffering he had endured to carry his booty, his eyes sparkled with happiness. Intermediate grade, advanced grade. Weight, 3,957 kilograms. Oracle features. Status, no change. Guidance, computing capacities are increased drastically. Can improve the performance of the Shadow Guide as well as the Oracle AI when access to the Oracle system's main network is impossible or fails. Ether vision, no change. The ether grade as well as most types of ether can be distinguished with the naked eye. Logging, mapping, no change. Scan LVL3, 2200M equals 12500M. Auto densification allows the bracelet to keep the same size regardless of its mass. Passive ether absorption from the atmosphere equals ether density 35/day. In this world, 1400/day compared to 40/day before. Oracle skill slots remaining, 6 greater than 15. Ether encoding slots remaining, 22 greater than 55. New Oracle skill, combustion. If the bracelet lacks ether, the liquid alloy can be used as a fuel, which could lead to a drop in the future performance of the Oracle device. New Oracle skill, alloy shielding/coating. The alloy can be used to protect the body from enemy attack or to coat a weapon, but be aware that the ether cost is high and not without risk. First, just the passive generation of ether guaranteed that he could live prodigally in any Oracle city in the mirror universe without having to work or take any risks. The replicated food provided by the Oracle store was now quite affordable and wouldn't affect his ether storage even if he spent the day stuffing himself. Second, the scan range had passed the 10-kilometer radius mark. This meant he could communicate with his allies within a 100-kilometer radius, which was now useful even on an island as large as this one. The number of slots for encoding and Oracle skill was a bit vague, but Jake knew from she that it was advanced grade encodings and Oracle skills. As for normal encoding like inferior strength ether or inferior sharpening ether, he could in fact collect several thousand different types of them. Not that it was of any use. The 2 new Oracle features were great, and Jake fully understood what risks the description was referring to. This liquid alloy had an exorbitant ether cost for each use, was perfectly useless to block a physical attack, and had no real sense of belonging to his bracelet once the alloy left his body. In other words, once out of his body, any evolvers could easily steal his precious metal by bringing their bracelet close to him. Furthermore, only the bracelet could be solidified. That's why the physical attacks were still working, just as driving a blade into a puddle of water would be met with little resistance. Jake couldn't understand why, because from a strictly logical standpoint, he couldn't see what was preventing the hard bracelet from extending its coverage to the rest of the body. He could only imagine that it was another limitation imposed by the Oracle and that it surely required an Oracle skill at an exorbitant price to acquire this feature. Nevertheless, it was perfect to protect his body from rays, radiation, and other harmful invisible attacks, although he was already quite resistant to most of these attacks. There was, however, one type of attack for which the alloy sounded extremely useful even to him, and that was that of protecting his brain from mental attacks. If he covered his skull with a thick enough coating of alloy like Magneto's helmet, he could definitely endure the Zorian's mental attacks without batting an eyelash. Driven by the satisfaction of his recent accomplishments, Jake thus kept walking step by step until he finally returned to the light of the Zorian cave. When he saw where all that light was coming from, and when a scorching wind caressed his face, Jake's good mood immediately suffered a major blow. While he was collecting his liquid alloy and slowly crawling out of the catacombs, lava had continued to pour into the city. After several hours, the basement was already completely flooded and was now submerged in 1 to 2 meters deep lava. A little more, and the temple hall would be flooded with lava as well. Yet it was not all the lava that was a problem for Jake. The magma chamber above was almost empty, and the lava cascade had long since been replaced by a thin trickle. If Jake really put his heart into it, he could always escape, even temper his body directly by bathing in all that lava. Sooner or later the lava from below would eventually cool and solidify, and the cave and its city would eventually disappear. No, the reason why Jake's face was so ugly right now was because of the individual floating in the air a few meters above him. It was a Zorian, but not just any Zorian. This Zorian had silver eyes, skin as dark as the darkness inside the temple, for membranous wings, and long silver hair veined with a vague blue light. The alien had a delicate, harmonious hourglass figure and a grace that no male Zorian had ever shown so far. It was a female. She was naked, but Jake could hardly feel any arousal when he first saw her. Not because she was unattractive. On the contrary, her beauty was outstanding and exotic, but because the darkness of her skin combined with its lack of texture prevented him from associating her with a living being. He had the feeling that if he tried to touch her, his hand would simply vanish through it like into a black hole. As incongruous as her appearance may be, Jake was not so tense because of this. Those eyes, that hair, that network of bluish light running through her body like an integrated circuit, that overwhelming, yet familiar aura? He had met a similar person before. A Slail, the Oracle instructor. Chapter 316. Let's talk, shall we? Obviously, this person was not a Slail. Her appearance shared distinctive similarities with him, and even though their auras were similar, there were still major differences between the two individuals. On the one hand, despite the apparent spiritual pressure this woman was exerting on him, there was nothing special about her. It was intense and heavy, but not to the point of making him lose his composure. On the other hand, he didn't feel the same sense of benevolent playfulness. This woman was cold, her expression unreadable, but he was certain that these two people were not connected. She might very well be an instructor, but she could just as well be a Zorian like the others. "You're an instructor?" Jake inquired in a deep, relaxed voice as if he was asking the time. In his current situation, he could not afford to show any sign of weakness. The young woman, who until then had seemed lost in thought, then looked at him, and a brief surprise fleetingly flashed on her face before regaining her indifference. Still, Jake noted that the sinking of his feet into the fractured ground had not escaped her notice. "Smart, but untrue," she answered a few seconds later in perfect English. "Although you're not completely wrong either." Jake thought that she would have attacked him immediately, but after responding to him she immediately lost interest and flew into the temple as if she had a mission to carry out and his fate did not concern her. Jake watched her until she vanished into the darkness of the temple, and with his upgraded ether vision, he could now see the etheric signatures from many kilometers away. If his Murtharian sight had no other features, such as pointing out weaknesses and analyzing minute details, this bloodline skill would have become obsolete. As a result, he had no trouble observing her lift the hatch in the hall leading to the catacombs, and then let herself fall inside. Jake continued to follow her etheric signature with his eyes until he lost track of her because of the metal insulation in the catacombs. He didn't need to be a genius to know where she was heading, and if he was still there when she realized that some of the liquid alloy was missing, the consequences would be tragic for him. Taking a deep breath, Jake gathered his courage and focused all his will to take off from the ground. After a few seconds, he managed to launch himself with the help of his telekinesis. His takeoff was silent, as if his weight had not changed, but in his mind he felt like he was towing an airliner. Now that his ether vision allowed him to perceive ether in many forms, he could see the turmoil that his telekinesis was generating around him. A portion of his carbohydrate and lipid reserves were converted into pure energy by an unknown phenomenon, then amplified by the ether in his spirit body to generate the intangible force under which his telekinesis manifested itself. At the same time, his spirit body regenerated the lost ether by sucking in that of the environment like a siphon. Jake was aware right now that he was about as discreet as an unrestrained scooter driving with headlights on in a residential neighborhood at 5 a.m. Anyone who could detect these ether fluctuations would be alerted at once. After taking off just a few meters from the ground, the lava under his feet began to ripple, then boil, and finally splash out like fireworks. Immediately afterwards, a shock wave exploded from below the altar, and he knew that the Zorian woman had just become aware of his deeds. Gritting his teeth, Jake accelerated slightly, but it was a lost cause. He wasn't even halfway up the cave ceiling when the supposed instructor was already back in front of him, this time with a richness of expression on her face that left no doubt as to what she thought of him. Her silvery eyes pulsed briefly, and then his telekinesis was broken. He felt, more than he could see, how the young woman's spirit body overlapped his own and wrenched control of the ether from him. Like a bird with its wings cut off, he fell miserably into the lava with a big splash. Jake was happy for once to be 2m15 tall. He was just tall enough to keep his head out of the lava by tiptoeing. Unfortunately, it demanded a hell of an effort. His skin sizzled slightly when he came in contact with the lava, but his accelerated healing was immediately triggered as soon as he was exposed to the intense heat. Although it was painful, he was not really in any danger. Even better, he could feel that this hostile environment was beneficial to his body and bloodline. However, it was not a time for rejoicing. A gust of air ruffled his hair, and when Jake looked up again, the young woman was floating right above him with the contempt of a goddess towering over a mortal. "Give me the alloy you stole, and I'll pretend our paths never crossed," she declared in a haughty manner with a threatening tone. Jake was expecting it, and his answer flowed out of his mouth without any hint of hesitation. Absolutely not. It was an outright refusal to comply. Needless to say, this was not the answer the Zorian woman expected. A terrifying mental pressure exploded from her body, suddenly sinking him under the lava. Jake was lying face down on the molten cave floor with 2 meters of lava above him, but there was nothing he could do to resist it. He already weighed 30 tons, so standing already required constant focus and an iron will. With this extra pressure, he was like a fly under a fly swatter, completely unable to struggle. For a brief moment, he thought he was going to be eliminated from his ordeal in this fashion, but after several minutes, he noticed that the Zorian woman hadn't pushed her offense any further. Jake was not stupid. If she really wanted to steal his metal, stopping him from committing suicide or dying was the priority. She could, just like the priest, cut off his limbs one after another after forcing him into berserk mode. Given the speed at which she had recovered the liquid alloy from under the altar, the soul spell he had just learned must have been child's play for her. As a result, he instantly grasped her dilemma. She wanted his alloy, but was unable to pick on him too directly. Even that mental pressure that kept him from moving was harmless to him. With the pores of his skin soaking up the lava around it was almost comfortable. After about a quarter of an hour, when she realized that the lava bath had no effect on him, she pulled him out of the lava by an invisible thread, and this time she inspected the human in front of her more extensively. Knowing very well what kind of players this ordeal was full of at this point, she finally took a long sigh and took her spirit body pressure off. "What's your name?" she asked in an authoritative tone that had no room for rejection. "Why should I answer? You're going to take it out on my family and friends, aren't you?" Jake sneered as he spat a flob into the lava in disrespect. His spit evaporated immediately on contact with the molten rock. The Zorian woman briefly clenched her fists, and a snarl comparable to that of a rabid wolf began to whir out of her mouth, revealing long, sharp canines very similar to his. "Your name is Jake Wilderth, 25 years old, from planet Earth. You grew up with your cousin Anya and your uncle Kalen. You lost your parents to the digesters and grew up in a toxic and competitive environment that made you antisocial, apathetic, suspicious, and resentful. You don't seem to care about anything or anyone, but you are afraid to die and thirsty for recognition. You want to be someone who can be trusted, but you don't want to sacrifice your freedom and privileges for others. You are also. Jake felt a chill when he heard the young alien woman spewing out all sorts of secrets about him one after another, some he wasn't even aware of. It was as if she had a report in front of her eyes containing all the details about him from birth, and she was just reading random excerpts. You are now under the jurisdiction of System ZZ-831 on planet B-842. Did you really think I was trying to get information about you? I was just being polite. They say that etiquette and decorum are important for members of your species. Jake was already dull when she finished her litany, and he barely noticed when she spoke to him again. This woman was too scary, but it was the oracle he hated above all else. Fucking totalitarianism. Seeing Jake's deflated face like a berated puppy, the Zorian woman nodded contentedly, but under those dejected features, she could feel the human anger rising. His downcast expression was merely a facade. Regardless, she was willing to play along. Let's talk, shall we? Chapter 317, A Small Favor. What do you want from me? Jake yelled with a mocking tone. If you know everything about me, you should already know that I won't give you the liquid alloy, and since I'm not stupid either, I know very well that you can't do anything to me, or you would have already sacrificed me on the altar. Facing the stubborn man in front of her, the Zorian woman's face twitched several times, but to Jake's surprise, she managed to contain herself and retained her gentle smile. Compared to the priest of the Chaos tribe, her self-control was commendable, though, admittedly, she was not influenced by any flinchium. I know for sure that you won't give me your medal, she admitted straight away after recovering her peacefulness. I'm not allowed to take it from you anyway, not even to exchange it for an equivalent reward. It's too late to get the medal back, and I know I can't convince you. So what do we do? And why are we still talking? Jake asked, this time in a perplexed tone. While there was a lot to learn from this potential Zorian instructor, he didn't see what he could bring to the discussion. Other than the system's name and the asteroid where he was passing his ordeal, he didn't know much about this place, and even less about something that would be of interest to an alien of this caliber. On the other hand, he knew that she had an oracle device or something similar on her wrist, and her rank was probably higher than his because of the ease with which she had retrieved his data. This meant that with the right wish, she could theoretically manipulate him and persuade him of anything by following her shadow guide instructions if such a path existed. Naturally, the thinking process that Jake was going through had no secrets for the young woman, and she had no fear of being tricked or deceived. The ether fluctuations caused by Jake's thoughts made this impossible. There is no need to panic. She eventually broke the silence as she ran her hand through her hair in exasperation. The deal is simple. I'll answer some of your questions, and you answer mine. The report on you does not include the happenings of your ordeals. I'm even willing to turn you into a Zorian Viscount right now for a small favor. How about that? What's the catch? Jake replied with the meticulous seriousness of a businessman about to close an important business deal. And how do you plan to do that? What are the pros and cons? How will I look after that? Will it affect my personality and my instincts? Will I lose my current bloodline, or is there a risk of conflict between these bloodlines if I do so? What about the risk associated with? Faced with the avalanche of questions from this human, the Zorian woman was seething inside, and a bestial grunt escaped from her mouth involuntarily. In response, a sly smile appeared on Jake's face when he noticed that she wasn't actually that good of an actress. With the control provided by his agility, he could indeed regulate his body language and not let anything show, but with his spirit body's fluctuations being perfectly visible, Jake had just realized that controlling his expressions and gestures was useless in front of a soul and ether specialist. Any participant with his intelligence and perception stats could easily deduce his true intentions and emotions from the ether's behavior within his spirit body or brain. Until he knew how to interfere with the ether vision and extrasensory perception of his enemies, being a good actor had indeed become useless. As a result, Jake didn't care anymore about being expressive, even if it meant appearing rude or insulting. At least the exchange between the two was honest. For an introverted person like him, it was just perfect. As for the Zorian woman above him, she seemed to be quite temperamental and made no real effort to hide her bad mood. After all, he had stolen a portion of her harvest. Yet, He could not clearly read her etheric signature. There was a kind of ether veil intentionally wrapped around her spirit body that interfered with his senses. The emotions she was showing could very well be faked and flaunted to put him at ease. As Jake wondered whether the young woman's outward frustration was real or not, she began to answer his flurry of questions, but the answer came much shorter than he expected. Becoming a Zorian Viscount is simple. I bite you, I drink a little bit of your blood, you drink a little bit of my blood, and it's done. Quick and painless. Like a vampire? Jake blurted out with skepticism. Phew, don't compare me to those cheap bloodsuckers. She loudly protested against such an allegation. I'm sorry, but I saw what the Zorians were doing in that cave, and to call them blood drinkers or vampires would be an understatement. Cannibal or ghoul might be closer to the truth. You do not mix the Zorian aristocracy with these corrupt tribes who are under our domination, and we cannot really be considered of the same species, and we hardly ever meet each other except in such circumstances where we come to collect the alloy or the annual Soulstones tribute. She had just leaked some very interesting stuff in a few words. Talking with this woman was indeed worthwhile. You're an instructor? And why do these Zorians have different bracelets from ours? They are clearly not participants, but you seem to have a bracelet connected to the Oracle system. Why do you have a bracelet connected to the Oracle system? Who was the Zorian that controlled the giant thrall? Unlike you, he didn't seem to mind the disappearance of this city. I already told you I'm not an instructor. She retorted with irritation. I am just the granddaughter of a Zorian who is one. My father is an Oracle overseer from the System A0 where we are, and my grandfather is an instructor who only reports to the Oracle and the Ancient Designer. As for the Zorian who controlled the huge thrall next to us, she started counting on her fingers. It should be Vishni, another very influential Zorian who has the trust of the Ancient Designer. But he's different from me. He's a player, just like you and the other participants, but with many more ordeals to his credit. Instead, answer my question. Do you accept to be turned into a Zorian Viscount in exchange for a favor? I assure you that the gain in power is incomparable to your current bloodline, even though I admit that this Murtharian bloodline does have some potential. I decline. Jake shook his head with a straight face. Boom. The temple behind had just blown up. Jake couldn't help but swallow with difficulty looking at the state of the monument behind him, which was already getting swept away by the lava tide. Soon there would be nothing left of this once majestic building. Ugh! The young woman clasped her head with both hands when she saw the irreparable damage she had just done in a burst of rage. In the end, she cast her eyes on Jake again and simply asked why. Because I don't trust you, and I guess that's how these Zorian thralls are created. True, they were awfully strong to the point of being virtually invincible, but they were brainless as if their souls were blank. I'd have to be a fucking moron to take a deal like that. It only happens when the individual's mind is too weak and can't handle the transformation. She objected promptly. Or when the soul has already dissipated. If you are converted by a silver Zorian like me, the result will be completely different, and you will become an aristocrat as I am, with unlimited growth potential. Well, yeah, tell that to someone else. Jake scoffed at her as he got impatient. Instead, tell me what favor you're talking about, and when I know more I'll make my decision. It wasn't that Jake was in a hurry, but the lava level had risen again during those few minutes, and he was starting to have trouble keeping his mouth out of the lava. To put it mildly, it was quite tedious. All right, I just want to know one thing. When you enter the ghost sanctuary later, tell me what you learned inside. If you tell me the truth, I promise not to come looking for you personally when B-842 loses its diplomatic immunity. Who knows? I might even be able to give you a hand. Why don't you ask another Zorian you trust instead? Jake found such a request to be meaningless. The priest of that tribe said himself that most of the slots were claimed by the Zorians training on the island each time the Phantom Sanctuary descended. With your abilities, entering this sanctuary should be child's play, right? As if she was expecting such a misunderstanding, the young woman uttered a long sigh of consternation. I can't do it, she finally said. It is forbidden. Only the Chaos, Dream, and Harmony tribes are allowed to train here. Silver aristocrats like me are not allowed to interfere with the running of the ordeal, nor to enter the Phantom Sanctuary. We are also not allowed to have an oracle device except for this inferior bracelet that we use. My situation is different because of my father's status as an oracle overseer, but I am subject to the same restrictions. My father lends me his authority and computing power, but my bracelet is the same as the other Zorians. Apart from concealing myself and detecting other Oracle device wearers, its use is limited. Our only way to get a real Oracle device is to sacrifice the participant's alloy to the ancient designer in order to get a bracelet. These tribes are paid graciously to steal your bracelets, and once in a while a silver Zorian like me comes here to collect these alloy tributes so we can get a bracelet or purify our bloodline. When you stole the alloy stored under the altar, it alerted me, and I came to collect the metal in emergency. Because of you, my future bracelet will be one grade lower than originally planned. This time her pouting face was heartfelt. Jake was rather intimidated by her at first, but he had figured out that the young alien was probably not much older than he was. In fact, she was quite immature. The reason she was so strong was probably because of the overwhelming ether density prevailing on the asteroid. If she lived outside the bubble in System A0, such a power was perfectly normal, even if he didn't think her strength was enough to withstand the gravity on the asteroid. I accept the deal, but how will you ensure that I keep my end of the bargain? Jake promised after careful consideration. If the Oracle or the Ancient Designer can stop the Zorians of the three tribes from spilling the beans about what's going on inside the Phantom Sanctuary, then what's keeping them from censoring me too? Very good question. She giggled while licking her lips. Even her tongue was silvery. And the answer is a servant contract. Chapter 318, Oral Promise. Are you fucking kidding me? Jake nearly drowned in the lava sea when he heard the solution proposed by the Zorian woman. Obviously, she had anticipated his reaction because her lips had curled up into a smug grin. Don't turn me down without knowing all the details. She explained when she saw that her lack of transparency could put an end to their exchange prematurely. It is I who will sign the servant contract. You? Jake gasped when he heard such an absurd promise. What's in it for you to be willing to make such a sacrifice? He had already grasped why she had offered to turn him into a Zorian Viscount. Based on his folkloric knowledge of mythical creatures like vampires or werewolves, he knew that there was usually a form of subordination from the transformed to the transformer. If the young alien signed a servant contract with him, the fact of having turned him into a Zorian would have effectively given her leverage against him. The contract and the subservience instinct associated with his new bloodline would have undoubtedly canceled each other out. Bad luck for her, Jake had refused. It was thus all the more surprising for him that she was still ready to take such a risk. A few minutes earlier, they were complete strangers, and the Zorian woman far surpassed him in every aspect. Agreeing to sign such a contract made no sense. If Jake could come to that conclusion, so could the Zorian woman. That is why she did not waste her time in useless chatter and immediately stated her reasons and the nature of the contract. You're clueless, aren't you? You don't know anything about the Zorian situation on this asteroid. On the surface, those like me who were born in System A0 should have exceptional abilities from birth, but we are actually exiled from the mirror universe. That incredible ether density that you perceived on the asteroid's surface, that's why anyone with the ability to leave this dying world will agree to sign a servant contract, even if it means giving up their full freedom. Most of the ordinary Zorians from the three tribes would even accept a slave or pet contract if it could allow them to escape from this. Anyway, if we do nothing considering the time flow difference between B842 and my world, this represents only 5 to 10 years on B842. System A0 has long since fallen and is so ancient that most stars and solar systems have already gone extinct. Apart from black holes and a few rare white or brown dwarfs at the end of their lives, there is nothing left. You surely didn't believe that this asteroid was just an asteroid, did you? This lump of rock is currently 10 times more massive than B842. Without the support of the Oracle and its guardians, such a technological miracle could not possibly exist. This is one of our 7 in System A0. This is why I am ready to sign such a contract with you, despite the restrictions it imposes on me. Why are you making that face? Jake currently had the expression of a dead fish, slack-jawed with his eyes opened wide. A somewhat puzzled frown filled occasionally with curiosity would show up on his face, as if he was witnessing an occult black magic beyond his comprehension. Sigh? Was I censored? She asked, fearing the worst. I'm afraid so. Jake replied with an apologetic smile. Your oracle rank is too low. Just remember that I didn't try to hide anything and that the contract is in your favor. Among the servant contracts, you know the slave contract where the slave must obey unconditionally the commands of his master, and the pet contract where the pet is given more freedom of action, but its resources and body still belong to its owner. It is essentially the same thing, but more nicely put. A pet contract nevertheless has advantages for both parties when the relationship between the two parties is close enough. Among the servant contracts, there is the actual servant contract, but there are also less restrictive contracts such as the subordinate contract and employee contract, followed by the serf contract. The one I want to sign with you is a real servant contract, just below the slave contract. The more Jake listened to her, the less he could understand her intentions. Was the situation in System A0 really so catastrophic that a brilliant and admired person among her people was willing to accept such a disadvantageous deal? Tell me how it is signed, what clauses you want to add, and why this particular contract and not another less restrictive one. I like to negotiate with intelligent people. The young woman laughed with relief when she saw that the human had implicitly accepted the deal. The servant contract obliges me to obey every one of your orders with the exception of those that oppose my fundamental values, which I must include in the clauses of the contract. If you accept these conditions, the contract can be signed automatically, but not now because I don't have my own oracle device yet. If I were to sign a contract with you now, it would actually be like signing a servant contract with my father. If he finds out, he will probably skin me alive. Jake had also realized the problem. Contracting a creature without a bracelet was probably possible, but it certainly required some precautions. It's possible, but it relies on summoning, sealing, or mind control techniques. She suddenly spoke in his mind with a pedagogic tone. For a true oracle contract, you would have to provide an oracle device to the future contracted. How do we proceed in this case? Jake inquired with a certain weariness in his voice. Once the ordeal was over, they were not likely to see each other again anytime soon. I'll contact you when your ordeal is over. I must first bring back the liquid alloy and complete the sacrifice to receive my oracle device. Once I have a real bracelet, I'll take care of the rest. In System A0, we're running out of everything but ether. When Jake heard this, he almost experienced an orgasm just thinking about the mountains of ether that he would get from his new servant girl. If he had to perjure himself by becoming an ether digger, he had no moral qualms about it. He had always been a progressive man. Fool, my fortune does belong to you, but my first clause will be that you cannot freely dispose of it until you are stronger than me. In any case, diplomatic immunity on B842 works both ways. The other planets and systems can't harm you for the next 5 years, but we can't help you either except with a special authorization from the Oracle system. Shit. Jake cursed as he lost interest in the young woman. He still had many questions, but they would have plenty of time to discuss them in the future. Phone calls across the mirror universe probably cost an ether fortune he didn't dare to imagine, but she would pay for it anyway. Where are you going? The Zorian woman was startled when she saw him float out of the lava with difficulty toward the stairs at the entrance to the city. Now that he had nothing more to fear, he no longer had to try to escape from the cave ceiling. You can't do anything to me. We have a deal, and if you want me to find out the truth in the Phantom Sanctuary, I'm going to have to get out of here first. At my current traveling speed, it will take a few days. Oh, hell no, not again. Jake, who had barely made it a few meters, suddenly heard her screaming in rage for no reason. When he turned around, he saw that her eyes were riveted in another direction, that he estimated to be where the island's snowy mountains stood. What is it? Another bastard just like you. I need to go. What's wrong with the players of this ordeal? First you, and now this. Jake didn't even have time to say goodbye to her that she had already vanished into the distance like a shooting star. If it wasn't for the discussion they were having, he might have thought that this whole encounter had been nothing but a dream. He didn't know her name yet, and this servant contract was only a hollow oral promise. If the Zorian woman did not recontact him, all this talk would have been useless. Nevertheless, he was still alive, and that was certainly the greatest victory of all. Now that the cave had been deserted and the rest of the alloy had been stolen, Jake had no more business here. After a few hundred meters, he let himself fall back into the lava and let himself drift like a starfish on the lava sea surface to recover. He then checked the player ranking and his status to take stock of the situation. Next, his eyes popped out of his head when he discovered why the Zorian woman had left in such a hurry. First place, Ruby Hale, species, human 266,845,569 points, 186 kills. Second place, Aleph Smith, species, human 224,347,862 points, 77 kills. Third place, Jake Wilderth, species, human 224,248,994 points, 127 kills. During the few hours he had spent in the catacombs absorbing the liquid alloy, he had dropped out of first place. He wasn't even second either. Given the Zorian woman's reaction and the changes in the player ranking, Jake instantly understood what had transpired. Another tribe's headquarters had just been wiped out, and the players responsible had started looting the alloy stored there. And without a doubt, Ruby Hale was the prime suspect. Chapter 319 Unraise. Somewhere on the island, far from Jake, in another cave whose vault was covered with bluish crystals reminiscent of glowing sapphires. The major difference compared to the cave where Jake lay was that the walls were not made of rocks, but ice. The temperature there was many degrees colder than zero. "Craig, how are you doing with that hologram?" A bald man in shorts with a claymore dangling from his hand asked curtly. "Shut up, Rio, you're distracting me." Craig, a small, chubby, black man answered just as curtly. The two friends who could not stand the darkness of the catacombs were about to squabble again when a footstep sounded from the long corridor behind them. As if the footstep sound was rooted in their subconscious, the two men stiffened up and radically changed their attitudes, smiling at each other as if they really were the best buddies in the world. There was no light in this tiny room with metal walls and ceiling except for the blue hologram filled with symbols floating above them. Yet the snow-white-haired young woman walking towards them could still be admired as if it were daylight. In fact, the young woman's entire body emitted pure radiance that seemed to be able to overcome even the most stubborn darkness. Still, what was most captivating was these two hypnotic eyes. The right eye was a deep marine blue, while the left eye displayed a rare amethyst color. "How's it going?" Ruby asked anxiously. The question was innocuous and the tone polite, but the chubby man immediately started sweating profusely. The woman was angelic, humorous, and unfailingly kind, but they had witnessed her clemency towards her enemies on many occasions. Never, oh never, would he ever want to antagonize her. This ether spell is super hard to crack. Craig tried to justify himself while awkwardly gulping down to moisturize his dry throat. How long? She had just raised an eyebrow, but for the two men a tiger's roar on the prowl wouldn't have been so frightening. "A few minutes maximum." "It's too long. I have a bad hunch. You are our future Etherist, so don't disappoint me. I would never allow myself." "Right away." Craig complied immediately when she gave him a warning look. As his chubby comrade got back to work twice as fast as before thanks to his adrenaline rush, Rio, who had his hands free, couldn't help but ask how it was going above. "The situation is under control. The last pocket of resistance of the Dream Tribe has been wiped out by me and Aleph." Ruby told him honestly with a deadpan face. "Oh, boom, bang, ta-ta-ta-ta. So what's all this noise we've been hearing?" Instead of answering, Ruby glanced up in the direction of the shooting sounds, and he had to repeat his question again for her to remember him. "Nothing special. Bawopi and his group showed up earlier to rescue their 3 imprisoned comrades." Bawopi, the Nosk?" Rio exclaimed in amazement. "In person. Nosks don't like the cold. The Dream Zorians took the opportunity to capture several of them. Bawopi did not appreciate the sacrifices. Bad luck for us. He came when Aleph, Xiaoming, and I were in the process of eliminating the prisoners. You know our policy. If they re-not human, we kill on sight. He saw this, so he's mad. He has already killed Mary and Rob." "What?" Rio and Craig shouted at the same time. Craig had nearly lost his focus. "Let me join the fight. I'm useless here." The bald man begged with both hands joined together. "Okay." Craig keeps going. Ruby agreed after a brief moment of hesitation. "Hurrah." Rio dashed towards the exit with his claymore in tow, and a few short instants later, a rain of insults mixing English and Japanese began to echo from time to time across the battlefield above. Meanwhile, under Ruby's intimidating gaze, Craig had not dared to dawdle. Approximately 10 minutes later, a perfect soul spell identical to the hologram was reproduced. Ruby suddenly felt drowsy as visual and auditory hallucinations started flashing around her, but by biting her tongue, she somehow managed to disregard them. After confronting these Zorians, all of them knew their mind tricks. When Craig cast the soul spell, the circular table in the center opened in half and a pool of liquid alloy was revealed. Boom! Quickly, Ruby hurriedly dived into the pool head first. Come on, let's absorb it all, and then we can help the others. We'll share equally later. Right. The chubby man jumped down after her with a reluctant face. He hated metal baths several hundred meters deep underground. Not that he had ever taken one. With the two of them, the pool level decreased rapidly, but while still more than 3/4 of the pool level remained, an overwhelming psychic pressure of unknown origin pressed them to the ground against the floor of the metal pool. Neither Ruby nor Craig could lift their heads. All they heard was a bitter snarl, followed by a "lucky bastards," and the psychic pressure preventing them from moving disappeared along with the pool of liquid alloy swamping them. Craig didn't care much about what had just happened as long as he was alive, but when he saw the translucent fangs and the psychotic glare of the beautiful young woman next to him, he felt faint with fright. Craig, yes, anything you want. Just don't eat me, please. I taste bad, and I'm not easily digestible. The chubby man suddenly lost himself in a long, pleading litany, full of nonsense. He was scared shitless. When Ruby was like that, her behavior was unpredictable, even for her allies. Recently, it had gotten worse and worse even though nothing bad had happened to them. Ruby's eyes widened slightly when she saw his overreaction, but she simply put a finger over his mouth to force him to shut up. Let's go help the others. I need to let off some steam. Sure, Craig nodded with apparent relief. A moment later, when the duo resurfaced, a certain Bawopi who knew nothing about any of this suddenly had a nasty premonition. When he saw the old man named Aleph and the Chinese man named Xiaoming retreat for no reason, his foreboding was confirmed. The already absurdly cold cave suddenly saw its temperature drop another notch. Then, he discovered the snow-white-haired woman who had butchered his people earlier, and he forgot all about his bad hunch. Seconds later, humans and Nosks were once again entangled in a fight to the death that was meant to last until a clear winner was determined. 6 humans against 9 Nosks. As for the few Dream Zorians who had survived in hiding, no one cared about them. Similarly, another similar scene took place in the center of the island where the Harmony Tribe Temple was located. However, the atmosphere there was quite different. Protected by the snow-covered mountain range of the Dream Tribe and the volcano and artificial creatures of the Chaos Tribe, the green plain where the Harmony Tribe was located was calm and peaceful. A gigantic temple had been built on this plain, and a whole city had been hidden inside. The wide and flat platform on the roof of this gigantic monument was strangely reminiscent of a heliport, but on a drastically different scale. The entire cave where Jake was now was probably able to fit on this platform with still enough room to add one more aircraft carrier. The overall standard of this temple's architecture and the materials it was made of seemed highly advanced technologically, light years away from the primitive settlements of the other 2 tribes. At each corner of the temple, high towers topped with a gigantic emerald crystal loomed over the plain with the tireless vigilance that only artificial intelligence could provide. Under normal circumstances, it was virtually impossible to discover the plane by chance and make it back alive. At this very moment, inside the temple, hundreds of players, many of the current top 100, were calmly biding their time, sitting around long stone tables and staring at each other menacingly. Unlike prisoners from other cities, they were neither bound, chained, nor handcuffed. They were free. None of them seemed to suffer any wounds, but the fresh blood spilled on the ground suggested otherwise. Every once in a while, a Zorian male wearing a suit with emerald green eyes would drop by to bring them refreshments or snacks, whenever they felt like it. Each time, he would exchange some small talk that made the participants laugh, although most of them chose to ignore or avoid him. Around a slightly secluded table, a lean man in his early 30s who had once worn glasses whispered something to a small, unusual dinosaur resembling a feathered baby dragon. In front of him, A pink-haired young woman in an Amazon outfit was sipping a strange purple mixture while making a face. Whatever the ingredients in this drink were, the result was disgusting. Although they had lost weight, gotten a tan, and toughened their expressions, their features had changed little. An imposing alien was napping next to them, but they didn't care. Jake would have no trouble recognizing them if he saw them. For these two humans were none other than Will and Inya. Chapter 320 Hakrasha. Who would have thought that we would meet again here? Life sometimes holds strange surprises. Will said plainly, stroking the feathers of the little winged dinosaur in front of him. The creature was actually purring with contentment, but the noise was closer to a hornet's hum than a relaxing throat snarl. Like a toad's throat, it swelled and deflated with high frequency, removing all the points of cuteness that the animal had earned so far. Inya winced again after sipping another sip of her drink, and only then did she take an interest in the feathered dragon with a vaguely intrigued look on her face. "Where did you find this creature?" she asked, changing the subject completely. "It looks like the wyverns of my world, but it's clearly just a lizard with bird wings. Not sure if this animal is a blessing." In response, Will just chuckled mysteriously. Seeing that he didn't intend to answer, Inya harumphed without politeness and forced herself again to swallow a sip of her foul drink. Reciprocally, as Will watched her ingest this nauseating decoction, he couldn't help but raise the question on the tip of his lips. "Why do you force yourself to drink this, and where does it come from?" Determined to return the favor, the young woman smirked and continued to sip in silence. "Serves you right." Alas for her, Will was a businessman. Keeping his cool and remaining friendly had always been his specialty. Since she was not willing to talk, he leaned against the back of his chair, folded his arms, and closed his eyes as if he intended to take a nap. Inya was seething inside when she noticed how she had been outsmarted by the businessman, but she swallowed her pride and accepted her defeat. After all the setbacks she and her sister had endured, her bad habits of pampered nobles had been greatly corrected. When she thought about her adventures on the island with her sister, sadness and regret flashed fleetingly on her face, and she couldn't help but glance at the big alien napping on the bench next to their table. This alien was about 3 meters tall and looked like a bronze Hulk with few differences. His bare feet and hands were covered with thick, long black claws, while a long series of horns of the same color ran down his spine. His bare torso revealed oversized muscles, while his legs were hidden by puffy canvas pants. There was also a long, hooked horn on the creature's forehead, whose skull had been wrapped in a turban of some sort. The individual was snoring shamelessly in the midst of all these players, indifferent to the prevailing tension. His snoring sounded like a small tornado. From time to time, the alien would change his position, letting a tar-like dribble of drool from his half-open jaw trickle down. As intimidating as this participant may seem, Inya could only be as relaxed as she was because he was right there beside her. No matter how much he slept, she knew that at the first sign of danger, this big dude would unleash hell to protect her. This carefree alien and player was called Hakrasha. Yeah, this Hakrasha. Formerly first in the ranking and currently sixth with almost 180 million points. Their meeting had taken place under dire circumstances, but she was grateful to have met him, or she would have been eliminated from this ordeal a long time ago. Before meeting him, Inya and Essia had survived alone by sticking together. At first, they had wanted to join Jake when he appeared, but they quickly realized that an invisible border separated the island in two. Trying to cross it meant exposing themselves prematurely to Zorian patrols, an enemy they unfortunately could not handle. Moreover, the land had been so turned over at this frontier that the soil was completely barren and devoid of vegetation. This no-man's land was quite large, a little more than 5 kilometers, and it was a part of the island that Jake had never visited. At the beginning of the third trial, this area was still passable. The Zorians stayed underground during the day and had not yet started chasing actively the participants. Unfortunately, this had changed when certain quarrelsome races such as the Nosks and Krishas had chosen to make this their territory. It was their way of challenging the Zorians' authority, but also of showing their superiority and dominance over all the other players timidly hiding in the jungle. The Nosks were still honorable, but one had to accept a duel to be allowed to cross, while the Krishas were as depraved as a humanoid fly could be. It didn't take long for the two sisters to realize that joining Jake and the others would be impossible. However, with the progress of their ether mental stats as well as their spirit body, their control over their fireball spell had become more and more adept to the point that they truly believed they could get through to the end on their own by remaining cautious and low-key. Regrettably, fate had decided otherwise. One night, as they returned to their camp, they met the three Krishes from the very top of the rankings. Like Tim weeks earlier, they had tried everything in their power, first resisting them, then fleeing with all their might. Unfortunately, they didn't have his luck nor any companions nearby. Essia, her little sister, had been blasted away by a plasma shot. She could still remember the disbelief on her sister's half-melted face. Even to this day, she still occasionally had nightmares about it. She knew that her sister was not really dead, but seeing her die before her eyes had still been a traumatic experience. For her sister, only a few hours would have elapsed when they met up on B-842 at the end of the ordeal, but compared to her sister, Inya had to learn how to cope with the loneliness. Although, she has never really been alone. When she thought she was doomed, she had bumped into Hakrasha, who was dozing around. In retrospect, it was definitely her shadow guide who had brought her here. She might have been thankful for the oracle, but the only thing she felt about it to this day was resentment. If there was a path that could save her, why hadn't they met this participant sooner? She still didn't have the answer. According to Ekinor, her oracle AI, there were too many possibilities to conclude with certainty. It could be due to interference from the Zorians or local soulstones deposits. It could also be due to the oracle system itself having decided to put her to the test in its own way. Although by saying this Ekinor was blaspheming against its creator. Perhaps before that, Hakrasha did not wish to be found. His oracle rank was, after all, above theirs. So Inya had to embrace reality. She had been saved by her bracelet, while her little sister had died miserably instead. Life is unfair. The oracle is unfair. That was what she had learned from this ordeal. The day she had met Hakrasha, everything had changed for her. As she knocked herself into him, the alien had simply grabbed her by her collar between two fingers and lifted her up to his face with curiosity. Seeing that she was harmless, he had let her go and went back to sleep. Just afterwards, the three Krishes had caught up with her and woke him up again by mistakenly hitting him with a plasma shot in the nose. Then, Hakrasha had flattened the culprit with one single almighty slap. The Krish had barely made it out alive thanks to its comrades, but she had learned that the alien had been killed shortly afterwards by a man named Aleph. Enya still didn't understand the alien's abilities. The only thing she knew was that he was absurdly strong and smart. He always knew what to do and seemed capable of achieving anything. When she had understood that he was mostly peaceful and compassionate, she had followed him everywhere like a shadow. When she was thirsty, he would conjure up water. When she was cold, he would provide her with clothes. When she wanted to earn points by hunting or doing missions, everything would become as easy as child's play, as if the rewards were coming straight to her. Too much had happened while accompanying him, but the second lesson she had learned on that island was to always obey Hakrasha. The beverage she was struggling to drink was his creation. It was disgusting, both in taste and texture, but it was truly miraculous. By drinking this potion, her body stats had significantly improved. The fire mana that she had been unable to regenerate since her arrival in the mirror universe had begun to replenish itself by converting the surrounding ether. Something she thought was impossible without elemental fire particles. Right now, even if she was threatened with a knife at her throat, she would continue to enjoy her drink until she died, no matter how much gagging it might give her. An hour earlier, Hakrasha had suddenly led her here to the island's center, and she had followed him as usual without second thoughts. She had been quite shocked when she saw the huge temple in the very middle of the plain. Heavily armed Zorians and thralls had immediately searched them and escorted them inside with menacing eyes. But faced with the Zorians of Harmony, Hakrasha had merely raised his hands up with a smile and then fell asleep on the bench where he had been sleeping ever since. At first, she had been anxious when she spotted all the dried blood covering the floor of the huge room converted into a tavern where the players were staying. But she had soon realized that the situation was not quite what she thought it was. The Zorians were friendly, and the participants were cordial to each other. It was hard to believe that a murderous battle royale was raging at this very moment. It was then that she had recognized Will at the table right next to the bench where Hakrasha had fallen asleep. Although she was surprised at such a coincidence, She had long since stopped caring about all these mysteries. Everything Hakrasha did was an enigma. Aware that neither Will nor Hakrasha intended to wake up to chat with her, Enya decided to kill time by watching the player ranking. A quick look around confirmed to her that she was far from being the only one. The mood was heavy and hostile despite the occasional loud laughter. Everyone knew that the descent of the Phantom Sanctuary was imminent. As she was shockingly discovering how the player rankings had changed in a few hours, loud arguing cries erupted a few steps away from her. Chapter 321, Friendly Tribe? Enya twisted her head towards the cries and saw an Aegean, a human from the same planet as her, clutching the Zorian waiter by the throat with a look blinded by hatred. If two scaly-skinned aliens had not immobilized him, he probably would have strangled the Zorian to death. Well, at least he would have tried. What's going on? A man's voice sounded close to her. Will was awake. Even Hakrasha, who was usually a heavy sleeper, had ended his nap. I don't know. The Zorian alien who distributes the food and drink appeared, said something, and this participant immediately tried to strangle him. Oh, again. Will commented with a yawn, still drowsy from his short nap. Clearly, he was used to this kind of clash. Hakrasha gazed at the infuriated Aegean and the frail Zorian with an expression that spoke volumes, and then just as Will immediately lost interest in them. It's happened before? Enya expressed her astonishment with a dubious face. She and Hakrasha had only been here for an hour, but Will seemed to have been here for a long time. And not just once. Will gave a forced laugh. To be honest, this kind of scene happens several times a day. I don't know about the other Zorian tribes on the island, but this one has a different approach to reduce our numbers. Fights to the death, preferably between us. Each time they ask for a sacrifice, the participants present are free to choose who will be sacrificed. Until a few days ago, they only asked for a little blood each day against lodging and food at will. Even though we were stuck in that tavern, it wasn't so bad. Some of them, like this waiter, are even very friendly, and you can learn a lot from talking to them. That changed about a week ago. Overnight, they started asking for sacrifices. Of course, a reason was given. They want to reduce our number so that the Phantom Sanctuary will come down. On their part, they are also committed to sacrifice a member of their tribe for every participant sacrifice. When the participants here learned that the Zorians would compete with us for the 100 places in the Ghost Sanctuary, most of them accepted the deal without batting an eyelash. It was either that or a pitched battle between players and the entire Harmony tribe. Some tried, and to say the least, it didn't end well. The giant monsters that serve them are just too damn strong. To complicate things, some alien species actually love this deal. This is the case of the Nosks and Krishas, who find single combat extremely honorable. As of yesterday, they started asking for several sacrifices at once. People who are isolated and without companions have already been sacrificed long ago. The players present now have to make sacrifices among their friends, and tensions are getting higher and higher. The human of your kind saw his little sister being escorted out of this room this morning by a few Zorian soldiers. She didn't come back, and her name has probably disappeared from the player rankings ever since. Since this player is too weak to take revenge on his group, he's taking revenge on that smiling Zorian waiter whom he believes is responsible for everything that happens to them. What an idiot. He would have been better off laying low in a corner away from all eyes. Indeed, just after Will concluded his speech, the Zorian waiter scanned the participants with his polite smile, without bothering about the hand grasping his neck. Serenely, his frail hand covered the human's hand against his throat and gently wrapped itself around one of his fingers. Crack. Aork. Vega Terilek. I will kill you. At first, Enya thought it was one of her fellow citizens, but when she heard him scream, she realized that he must be living in a neighboring country. Maybe it was because of the pain that he cursed him in his native language, but he didn't seem to have mastered the Oraclean. Unsurprisingly, these threats were short-lived. The human was already restrained by two large aliens, and no one seemed willing to risk his life to assist him. Is this one of the chosen sacrifices? The waiter asked courteously, always with the same affable smile. No answer. Even his former allies did not have the courage to assume the burden of having sent one of their comrades to his death. I take this silence as a yes. The Zorian in costume smirked approvingly at the crowd's reaction. Unfortunately, this is not enough. I need 5 more sacrifices this time. What? But the last time was 4? Why 6? The former leader of the outcast, a humanoid monster as repulsive as an orc, vociferated with barely contained fury. Does it make a difference? The Zorian waiter calmly replied. The sooner your number is reduced to 100, the sooner the next trial can begin. Of course, we will also choose 6 sacrifices on our side to show our good faith. Bullshit. An alien, who until then had been apathetic, spat disdainfully. Where are your sacrifices? We've never had proof that anyone was sacrificed on your side. Every day we are stuck in this room. We piss and shit over each other without being able to do anything. If the sacrifices don't kill us soon, the smell will. The Zorian waiter squinted slightly, but did not get angry. What do you suggest in this case? The Zorian spread his arms in an invitation to speak freely. Our sacrifice against yours, and the fight must take place in this room in full view of all. Far from being offended, the Zorian tilted his head sideways with wonder, gazing at him as if he had just discovered a fascinating freak show event. Are you sure? The waiter probed with the expression of someone barely holding back from cracking up laughing. Definitely. You participants also agree? The Zorian representative then gauged the opinion of the crowd. I don't care. A large Nos croaked coldly without leaving his stone chair. Krish. Sounds good to me. Moments later, the decision had been approved, and the waiter left to inform his superiors. Enya took the opportunity to ask, well, the supreme question. By the way, how come you're still alive? Didn't you say the players alone were sacrificed first? Will did seem to have taken a liking for his aura of mystery, for once again he responded with a bizarrely melodious chuckle. I'm not alone. I am never alone. As he said this, he showed the hollow of his sleeves, and 2 sapphire-eyed cobras whistled in a bad mood as they were exposed for all to see. Will then beckoned for her to raise her eyes to the ceiling, which was over 50 meters high to house the thralls. When Enya looked up, a dark ceiling, almost devoid of light except for a few luminescent green crystals, covered her vision. Then as she focused, she suddenly saw the darkness come alive. Only then did she realize that the tavern's ceiling was teeming with life. All these creatures are with you? The young woman stammered in awe. Not all of them, but most of them. We'll explain nonchalantly. Enya breathed sharply as she heard him confirm, but it also allayed her doubts. What was on her side anyway? As for Hakrasha, he was sleeping again. A moment later, the Zorian waiter returned to the room accompanied by 6 Zorians dressed in rags and an escort of green-eyed thralls the size of a small building. There were 3 men and 3 women, but despite their shabby clothing that reflected their poor social status, their height and build was among the greatest they had ever seen among the inhabitants of this tribe. Enya had earlier identified the Krishas who had killed her sister, but they now formed a group of about 10 individuals. Although the other Krishas were not so highly ranked, there was no doubt that they were dangerous. Her revenge would have to wait. In comparison, the Krish leader had not recognized her. She was but an insignificant prey like the others. Did a cat remember all the mice it had hunted? On the other hand, he remembered very well the bronze alien covered with horns that accompanied her. Even with all his comrades present, he had no desire to mess with them. As for Will, they could kill him whenever they wanted, but they would have to pay a price. It was pointless to take unnecessary risks when there were other weaker prey left to sacrifice. In fact, if Will seemed relaxed enough to close his eyes, he was actually extremely tense. Without the creatures that kept him safe, he would have been dead long ago. It was a miracle that he hadn't killed anyone in self-defense yet. Accordingly, 5 more sacrifices were quickly selected and the death fights resumed, this time in full view of all participants. After watching the results of the first few fights with horror, Enya had long since forgotten the changes to the player rankings that had shocked her so much a while earlier. In the meantime, why is it that the players keep getting fewer and fewer, even though I've eliminated an entire tribe? Jake grumbled in a bad mood as he swam through the lava at a snail's pace towards the exit. At that pace, the Phantom Sanctuary might well descend before he even made it out of that cave. He absolutely had to hurry. Chapter 322. Being heavy isn't that bad. Damn it. Jake's exasperated wail suddenly broke through the silence somewhere deep in the lava-flooded cave. The lava had long since submerged the old city houses, and the vault of the cave was not so far from the lava waves that periodically rocked the walls. In the midst of all this lava, A miserable-looking human was struggling valiantly toward the surface. Jake could have escaped much sooner if he had wanted to, but he had given up the easy way out. Who cares if he left this place prematurely, if it meant facing all kinds of threats without being able to move an inch? With telekinesis and his other powers, Jake wasn't actually that helpless. If he really focused and activated his spirit body at full power, breaking out of here was perfectly feasible, and he could even fight. However, he would become so exhausted that he would be exposed to many dangers when using this method. The reason Jake chose to stay here despite the rapidly rising lava level was because the environment was extremely beneficial to him. After his bloodline had evolved, his accelerated healing had developed a passive property that was automatically triggered in favorable environments. This underground cave, the lava, the high temperature, and the flintium crystals illuminating the vault were all elements creating a perfect environment for him. Even though his body was not tempered as quickly and efficiently as if he was buried immobile underground, the effect was far from insignificant. With 30 tons of liquid alloy weighing down his body and a stimulating environment like this, Jake was determined to get the most out of it before the Phantom Sanctuary arrived. Jake had already given up the idea of accomplishing any further feats or missions. At first, he planned to return to fight the Abyss Behemoth, but this was no longer possible. Not to mention if he could make it to the beach in time, he had a good chance of sinking like a stone with no chance to try anything. Disappointing as it was, Jake had already accepted the idea that he couldn't win at all. Perhaps that was the goal of all those feats and missions. No matter how a player spent his time on the island, whether he was weak or strong, he would be rewarded for his efforts one way or another. No matter how Jake judged his current predicament, he felt that he was one of this ordeal's big winners. Therefore, he had nothing to complain about. Moreover, it was not as if Jake was going back to the surface empty-handed. In addition to the liquid alloy slowing him down, he hadn't forgotten to scan the Zorian grimoires inside the treasure room before he left. Even though the language was unfamiliar to him, there were precious ether spells models inside. A myriad of soul spells, certainly inspired by the study of a red soul stone by one of their ancestors. Although he couldn't make use of it at the time, it was certainly a significant gain. Because he didn't speak Zorian, Jake was beginning to regret not having invested in a universal translator. Perhaps the analysis would have allowed him to improve the rating of his current exploration mission. Jake still hadn't asked for his rewards, and the final verdict was still pending. He was dying to scan the entire city to satisfy his curiosity, but the expense of ether would undoubtedly be high. He wasn't sure it would be worth it. Do it, she coldly encouraged him. Even if the rewards of the quest itself prove to be lousy, it will certainly influence the final rating of your ordeal. In my opinion, your ether points exist to be spent. On the other hand, knowing you, you'll be consumed with regret if you don't. An evolver should never regret his actions. She, do you remember your financial situation from your old life? Jake asked suspiciously. If his Oracle AI was drowning in debt, overspending, or suffering from a gambling addiction in the past, his decision to listen to her or not would certainly be affected. I think I was. Hey, is that really what you think of me? She grew instantly angry, as if he had hurt her self-esteem. TSK, do what you want, I don't care. And so, she fell silent, leaving him alone to make his decision amidst the tumult of the lava waves. Jake uttered a humph, but having just realized that his Oracle AI had a more fragile ego than he thought, he immediately applied her advice to show his good faith. Anyway, she wasn't wrong. With his curiosity, if he didn't go through with it immediately, he was sure to dwell on it again and again in the future. Jake apprehensively set the Oracle scan range to maximum and then mentally activated the bracelet's feature. A powerful ripple, visible only to him, pulsed briefly from his body and vanished soon after. Almost simultaneously, the scan report emerged virtually before his eyes. The mass of data was such that he immediately begged she to forgive him and let her take over the sorting of all this information. The Oracle system could provide a lot of information based on his Oracle rank, but if he had to search for the useful information on his own, it would take him several days at the very least. Jake also felt a little bit of sadness in his heart when he saw his precious ether points magically evaporate. That one maximum range scan alone had cost him over 1M ether points. It was more than he thought. but he was already mentally prepared for it. She had explained to him beforehand that the alloy increased the bracelet's performance, but had little effect on his energy levels. Only the Oracle seemed to master this technology. The only known way to increase the energy level of his Oracle device was via a promotion of his Oracle rank, since this energy was one of the perks. This was how high-ranked Evolver's Oracle devices could continue to become more and more powerful, while having Oracle skills at a reasonable activation cost, even if the weight of their wristbands had changed little, if at all, over time. Ultimately, it was the combination of the two aspects that had to be sought, and that created yet another reason to depend on the Oracle. "It's done," she muttered resentfully before pouting again. Jake paid no attention to her fake grudge. With the age and experience of his AI, there was no way she could sulk as long as an immature teenager. She was just pulling his leg. Knowing that her bad acting had been exposed, she stopped shilly-shollying and summarized the most important information for him. No players, no life forms nearby. There was another building hidden behind the temple. According to my data, it was the biological factory where many of the creatures inhabiting the island are engineered. Another section seems to be a laboratory where the crystals controlling these creatures are designed. Unfortunately, lava has already begun to infiltrate the building. Apart from the crystals, everything of value has already been destroyed. Jake lamented missing this secret laboratory, but if he had explored it, he might not have had the opportunity to harvest the alloy. At least his curiosity was sated, and he knew he hadn't missed anything too crucial. If he had cleared his mission without doing this scan, his rating would probably not have been so close to perfection. For the missing points, he knew that it was due to his lack of knowledge of the Zorian language. She selected and ordered all the relevant data. Then Jake submitted all his findings and finally completed his mission. Side quest: The Tribe of Chaos completed. Rating: 98%. Rewards: 50 MPTS, Zorian Language Manual. New title: Harbinger of Chaos. Not content to have exterminated single-handedly the Chaos Tribe, you also fomented the complete extermination of the city by the lava while appropriating their most precious treasures and knowledge. Effect: Passive soul skill. Better tolerance and performance when exposed to the energy of a soul stone and soul energy in general. Your body is less exhausted and remains lucid in a berserk state. Active soul skill. Bloodline ignition. Your bloodline will be temporarily enhanced to the next level in exchange for an equivalent sacrifice of life, energy, and ether. No sooner had he finished reading than the ether around him suddenly condensed under the influence of an unknown mystical force and took the form of a brilliant red soul glyph very similar to the soul spell hologram below the altar. As for the preceding glyphs, the strange symbol composed of millions of ether runes floated towards him, then disappeared in a flash of light upon contact with his soul. When he came back to his senses, Jake realized that he had momentarily canceled his telekinesis and had sunk miserably to the bottom of the lava. Cursing the bad timing of this soul glyph, he deployed his spirit body forcefully to reach the surface, but deep inside, he was ecstatic. For one thing, he was once again first in the player ranking. Jake didn't consider himself superficial and preferred to remain low-key, but Ruby and Aleph had stolen his first place so fast that he had kept a bitter feeling. Getting back his first place could be considered a meager revenge, however pointless and petty it might be. With his motivation boosted by his recent awards, Jake found the energy and will to continue his journey to the surface by swimming. It turned out to be a great workout, as effective as he had hoped. By the time Jake breathed in the fresh air outside the volcano, 4 more days had passed. Although his muscles were excessively congested and his face was red from the effort, he was now able to move around without the help of his telekinesis. A nearby T-Rex was immediately baited by this trembling and immobile prey, and a stream of saliva immediately began to dribble down his jaw. Excited, the dinosaur charged towards its future meal with its jaws wide open and reveling in the sight of the human still trembling in terror as it approached. "Fuck off." Jake dodged the charge with a sidestep, then slammed down his fist like a hammer on the monster's huge skull. His attack wasn't particularly fast, but when his fist landed on the T-Rex, the dinosaur felt like it was being trampled by a huge brachiosaurus. A loud crack sounded and the T-Rex's eyes rolled back as its head sinked into the ground, generating a shock wave. Just before he died, the dinosaur's gaze landed on the cracked rock where Jake's feet were embedded in several centimeters deep, and only then did it realize that this prey had always been the predator. Being heavy wasn't all that bad. Chapter 323, Collecting Rewards. The first thing Jake did while breathing in the fresh air of the island was to realize that underground or outdoors, it didn't make much difference. It was as dark inside as outside. His second action was to recheck his player ranking for the umpteenth time, and his anxiety rose slightly when he noticed that the number of participants had dropped again. Jake felt like he had been on this island for years, but it had really only been 53 days since his second ordeal had started. He had only been on the island for just over a month. In fact, he still hadn't broken his grandfather's record. Lucky old man, Jake muttered as he set off towards the island's center, shaking the earth with every step he took. He was pretty sure that not every second ordeals was like that. He had just confirmed that there were only 196 participants left on this island. If his grandfather's ordeal had been so difficult, he had to reassess the old man's abilities. Jake had chosen to head towards the heart of the island without hesitation because it had become obvious where the Phantom Sanctuary would land. Just by looking up at the night sky above him, he had seen an oddly flickering pyramid-shaped object that wasn't there before. The object was not large in his field of vision, like a ping-pong ball 10 meters away, but Jake could easily predict that the island's center was indeed its destination. And given the distance separating it from its destination, the celestial object must have been quite imposing. Only the so-called Phantom Sanctuary fitted this description. If he had any doubt at this point, locating the players left with his shadow guide had confirmed his suspicions. With the exception of a few cautious participants like Tim and Lily, who refused to take part in the final battle, everyone without exception was in the same place, including Will, Inya, Kevin, and Kate. Of course, he could not locate everyone. Quite a few participants had a higher oracle rank than he did. During his 4 days of volcanic swimming, his perseverance had shown its worth, and the reward was commensurate with his efforts. His strength, constitution, and vitality especially were incomparable with what they had been before. Ether status. Strength, S 231.6 points, 202 greater than 231.6. Agility, A 251.4 points, 230.3 greater than 251.4. Constitution, C 246.7 points, 224.6 greater than 246.7. Vitality, V 241.8 points, 227.4 greater than 241.8. Intelligence, I 236 points, 233.2 greater than 236. Perception, P 225 points, 224.6 greater than 225. Extrasensory perception, EP 227 points, 223.9 greater than 227. Body status. Physics, Mertherian body, LVL2. Height, 2.16 meters, 2.14, 2.16 meters. Weight, 246 kilograms. Strength, 106 points, 74 greater than 106. Agility, 68 points, 66 greater than 68. Constitution, 121.9 points, 94.3 greater than 121.9. Vitality, 117.3 points, 91.6 greater than 117.3. Intelligence, 39.4 points, 39.1 greater than 39.4. Perception, 33.2 points, 32.8 greater than 33.2. Jake was satisfied with such a tremendous improvement, but he could not help but be frustrated deep down inside as well. He had grown another 2 centimeters. When would his growth stop? He was really starting to freak out inside. He remembered just how tall the hero mermaid was, who was literally a giant, and he couldn't help but be pessimistic about his future love life. Well, at least he was unlikely to be messed with for no reason. Talk about a consolation. His trip to the island center took him 3 extra days. Jake could have reached the central plain in no time, and that was his initial intention. However, the number of remaining participants had suddenly stopped falling. Instinctively, Jake felt that the descent of the Phantom Sanctuary was the reason. He knew from the mouth of the deceased Chaos Tribe Zorian priest that the number of players needed to be cut down just enough to trigger the appearance of the sanctuary. Obviously, this goal had been achieved during his venture beneath the volcano, or the pyramid ship flashing like a disco ball would not have emerged so suddenly out of nowhere. As imposing and flashy as this floating sanctuary could be, the object descended atrociously slowly. It was with this in mind that Jake had chosen to take his time to finish the few feats he had left. During those 3 days, Jake had completed a large number of hunting feats, as well as most of the auxiliary exploration feats, such as herbalism, geology, botany, biology. These auxiliary exploits had been ridiculously simple to accomplish up to the diamond level. All he had to do was to make a good big scan at maximum range every 20 kilometers. It had cost him a few million ether points, but the rewards had more than made up for his investment. Once she had finished compiling all the data, Jake had completed all of these feats in one fell swoop and reaped the rewards. He was not the only participant to have done so, and the scores of most had skyrocketed sharply in the last week. His only regret was that he hadn't met any monster bosses, even with the scan's assistance. Those dinosaurs that scared him so much before seemed to have completely disappeared from the island. A shame that this was happening just when he was finally confident to face them. The other good news was that after completing all these hunting feats, Jake had finally been able to combine his 2 soul glyphs, Abyss Apex Predator and Ocean Apex Predator, with his new Apex Terrestrial Predator glyph that he had just obtained to create a 4th one. Title: Apex Predator. Diamond. Your body emits an extremely intimidating aura to other creatures, causing them to overestimate you. Also works against weak-minded evolvers with inferior abilities. Is obtained by exterminating all apex predators in an area to the point where the few survivors recognize their inferiority and flee upon your sight. Other perks: night vision. You can no longer be dazzled by a change in light. Lurking. When you hunt or spy, your presence fades away. Side ration. The prey that crosses your eyes can be paralyzed by fear. Jake now had fewer glyphs than before, but the new one had all the benefits of the previous ones with a few extras. Overall, he was satisfied with his reward. The remaining list of available feats was almost endless, and he had no doubt that he was far from having peeled all the island's secrets. Regardless, he had done his best, and that was all that mattered. Once all these rewards had been collected, Jake was comfortably settled at the top of the ranking with more than 310 million points. He had never been so rich, but after using his scan many times he knew it was just an illusion. He could become poor again just as quickly. The 3 days of traveling alone had also served another purpose: to allow him to become familiar with his body weight and his new muscles. It was the first time since his arrival in the mirror universe that Jake was suffering from a stats imbalance. Previously, his agility and intelligence had always been aligned with his strength, and he had had no trouble controlling his physical strength. In the lava, this was not noticeable. On land, however, Jake's movements were excessively brutish, and combined with his 30-ton mass, he could probably crush a dog's skull to death trying to pet it. If Sarah tried to hit on him once more, she would probably think twice and would be better off being on top. If she didn't, Jake didn't even dare to think about it. Luckily, he was smart, and the gap wasn't too critical. All this fighting had allowed him to adapt, but most of all he found that he needed his telekinesis to form a force field under his feet to better distribute his body weight with each step. He had lost count of the number of times the ground had collapsed as he walked by before implementing this. Crossing the snow mountains had also been tricky, but by the time he reached the valley on the other side, he had regained almost perfect control of his body. When he discovered the plain encapsulated in a bright, ghostly greenish glow, Jake was momentarily taken aback, but it was the monument in the center that caught his gaze. Will, Inya, and all the other players were inside. With his present senses, Jake should have been able to hear the conversations inside the building, but the temple was remarkably quiet. A few Zorians with emerald eyes and armor were patrolling around the structure, and as soon as they saw a human appear, they immediately surrounded him, pointing their spears at him. Right now, Jake was wearing a new obsidian armor hastily forged with his powers, and his appearance was really intimidating to these guards. Since he could easily reforge anything in an instant from rock, He had designed an armor that was horribly thick and disproportionate to be able to draw the raw material he needed at any time. Spirituality was the Zorians' specialty, and they were all aware of the large force field deployed beneath Jake's feet. Even if they did not understand the reason for it, they knew that some very powerful Zorians on Eleanor moved in the same way. Moreover, his new soul glyph, Apex Predator, was definitely having an effect. These Zorian guards, usually arrogant and confident, were barely holding back from running for their lives. Chapter 324, Last Trial. If you want to enter the temple, you must allow yourself to be searched and entrust your weapon to us. The patrol leader, the only one putting up a brave front, asked timidly when he saw the huge cleaver in Jake's hand. The weapon in question was almost 5 meters long and as wide as his chest. It lay motionless on his shoulder, but it was still quite ominous. Jake stared intensely into the patrol leader's shifting eyes for a few seconds, then calmly replied, "Sure." A guard came to seize his weapon, and Jake leisurely tossed it towards him as if it were a small wooden stick. Unconsciously influenced by the ease with which he was carrying this weapon, the Zorian mechanically raised his arms to receive the item without suspecting anything. And then, he was carried away. Like a beginner trying to lift too heavy at his first bench press, the guard found himself pinned down on the floor with the huge cleaver in his hands. It took 2 of his colleagues to help him up. The Zorians present drew a deep cold breath when they saw this, but they avoided any comment. Once they were sure he had no other weapons, the guards escorted him inside without wasting time. Before entering the temple, Jake lifted his gaze above him and saw that the phantom sanctuary was about to land on the platform at the top of the temple. He had arrived on time. When he entered the gigantic building, Jake discovered another Zorian city with more elaborate and advanced architecture, but having already wiped out an entire tribe, he was not particularly distressed. He took great care, however, to memorize all the discrepancies. The Harmony tribe was more civilized than the Chaos tribe and technologically more advanced. The thralls were more numerous and on average larger in size. Even from a distance, Jake could see the massive silhouettes of at least 4 skyscraper thralls that he was not confident of facing. After a few minutes, the Zorians escorting him stopped in front of a dark, smooth brick cube building. There was no glass or decoration, and after placing their hands against the wall, the smooth bricks folded back on themselves to open a passageway. "You can come in. If you need anything, just ask one of our representatives inside. It is forbidden to leave this room until further notice." Even though it may appear on the surface that you are prisoners, this is not really the case, as you will realize once you are inside. Things should change in a few hours. The patrol leader explained summarily in the flaccid tone of someone who had repeated these words hundreds of times. Perhaps because Jake was more intimidating than most of the other participants, the Zorian had felt the need to be a little more explicit than usual, but it was still extremely elusive. A Zorian who had become magically confident once in the temple pricked his back with the tip of his spear to prod him forward. But he cringed when he saw that the human had not been unbalanced, nor had he even reacted to his attack. As for the tip of his spear, it was definitely shorter and blunter than before. Not caring much about their shenanigans, Jake entered the building undisturbed and was immediately greeted by the strange atmosphere of an alien saloon. There was no music or decoration inside, and the mood was rather austere. However, as in any popular tavern, the stone tables were all occupied and the participants present were drinking and feasting freely without worrying about their peers. Well, that was at first glance. At second glance, Jake noticed the blood trails of various colors, the smell of urine, sweat, and feces, and the palpable tension that threatened to engulf him. They were all laughing, drinking, and eating as if nothing had happened, but a fight seemed to be on the verge of breaking out at any moment. Naturally, Jake took note of the space in the middle of the room, which was devoid of tables and chairs. It was also the place with the most blood and guts on the floor. Upon seeing a newcomer, the players present raised their heads in his direction, but when they saw that it was just another human, most of them lost interest immediately. Not everyone. "Jake!" A female voice suddenly rang out, and when Jake turned his head to it, he recognized Enya and was sitting together around a table. A large bronze alien covered with horns was sleeping idly on the bench next to them. A little further on, Kevin, Kate, and his 2 other cousins George and Bryce were also present. Seeing them, Jake cracked a smile and strolled relaxingly in their direction. With a wave, he grabbed a stone chair with his telekinesis from a nearby table and sat unceremoniously next to Enya and Will, whom he hadn't seen in a while. While he was catching up with his classmates, a Krish widened his big orange fly eyes in his direction. He had only seen this person once from a distance, but how could he not remember it? Krish, do you recognize him? His captain calmly asked his subordinate, who was none other than arrogant Krish, the one who had chased him and Sarah weeks earlier. Krish. Yeah, that's him, the human because of whom I retreated. The leader, who was more than 3 meters tall, squinted his eyes slightly as he heard these words, which wasn't simple at all with globular, bug-faceted eyes. With his experience and his keen senses, he knew that this human was the real deal. Human players were weak most of the time, mere cannon fodders, but there were exceptions. Sharing the same concerns, the two Krishes gazed at another table in the tavern where a group of humans were feasting in silence. The old man at that particular table had left them with a very bad memory. Their comrade had been finished off by him after Hakrisha had mortally wounded her. Their two groups were irreconcilable. The most shocking thing was that he seemed full of deference to the frail human with long white hair sitting next to him. The young woman was not malnourished or in poor health. For the Krish, anything less than 2 meters tall and weighing less than 200 kilograms was considered frail. This group of humans had arrived a few hours earlier, and some of the players present had immediately proposed them as the next sacrifices, thinking they were dealing with a bunch of weaklings. Result: 1 Nosk, 2 Krishes, and 4 dead Wangles. The Wangles were aliens 3 to 4 meters tall with 2 pairs of arms and a mushroom-shaped skull. Their skin was red-brown and seemed slimy and soft like that of an octopus. Although they weren't in the top ranks, none of them had died since the ordeal began. The arrival of these humans had put an end to this record. Jake, on the other hand, had already memorized the faces of all the participants, and the gloomy gaze of the 2 Krishes on him had not escaped his notice. He had also spotted the group of humans at the other end of the tavern, but he had subconsciously not associated the look of the white-haired woman with that of Ruby Hale. After all, the difference was too striking. Even though he knew that she had certainly changed after her arrival in the mirror universe, it was impossible for him to imagine her other than by her hideous and terribly handicapped appearance. He had a vivid imagination, but almost 8 months had passed since their only meeting. Although he remembered her name and vaguely remembered her original features, it was too long ago. As soon as Jake looked away from this group of humans, the wary gaze of the white-haired young woman had instantly focused on him, but he hadn't noticed anything. This was not, however, the case of her own companions. Do you know him? Aleph inquired in a hoarse voice as he carried on sharpening his sword with a grindstone. The old man was the military instructor in charge of supervising this group of young prodigies. Wang Xiaoming, the Chinese middle-aged man also sitting at this table, was his assistant. It was a huge sacrifice for them to start their ordeals so late just to ensure the coordination and safety of these kids. Ruby in particular was a special case. Orphaned since birth, she had been officially raised by her aunt. Except that she didn't have any aunt. As a pupil of the Earth government, her aunt was only a legal guardian, and she had spent the first years of her life in a military hospital. Her talent had only been discovered by letting her test the VR game Trial Worlds by chance. Perfectly aware of how few friends she had and how few opportunities she had to make some, it was strange for Aleph to see her so unsettled at the sight of someone. Faced with the inquisitive gaze of her superior, the young woman averted her eyes from Jake and simply retorted with an angelic smirk. "If I told you it is my soulmate, would you believe it?" Hearing this, Craig and Rio feasting beside them violently choked on their food. If their constitution wasn't so high, they probably would have died just like that. Aleph and Xiaoming were surprised, but they knew better. When they were about to ask for more details, the artificial voice of the sanctuary bubble abruptly broke the silence, resonating in the minds of everyone, humans like Zorian. The 4th and final trial was about to begin. Chapter 325, The Phantom Sanctuary. Congratulations, Jake Wilderth, for being one of the 187 participants still in the running after having survived 1 month, 26 days, 3 hours, 18 minutes, and 17 seconds in the sanctuary bubble. 20 points for being first place in the player rankings. Jake, like many other players, was surprised to hear the artificial voice they hadn't experienced since the beginning of the third round. If his memory served him right, the Battle Royale was not supposed to end until the 100 finalists had been determined. The fact that the rewards were distributed in advance meant that the Sanctuary Bubble made a clear distinction between the third trial and what was to follow. By giving them their rewards now, the underlying message was that they could now die at any moment, and that strength alone would not be enough. Hence the premature rewards. By being first in the third trial, Jake was at least guaranteed an exceptional rating, even if he died shamefully in the next second. What particularly shocked Jake was the exact amount of time he actually spent in the Sanctuary Bubble. He had not forgotten that his grandfather had been eliminated after a month and 26 days. In other words, the reason for his elimination probably had a lot to do with the conditions of the next trial. Like him, Enya and Will were calm as they listened to the monotonous congratulations of the artificial voice in their heads, but not everyone was. A few participants, although rare, were not prepared for the last trial to begin so quickly. Once the congratulations and additional rewards were distributed, there was a pause, and then the artificial voice resounded in their minds again. The fourth trial will begin in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Bang! A deafening sound of impact rocked the temple walls, and the ground began to shake as if an earthquake had just struck right next to them. Some aliens raised their shields or arms above them to protect themselves from possible collapse, but their concerns were unfounded. The temple stood firm. Then suddenly, a weird thing happened. A shrill sound rang out noisily as if someone had just whistled directly in their ears, and the scenery before them changed radically. Farewell to the cold walls, the stone tables and chairs. They could see the night sky again, and they were randomly scattered on a gigantic platform several kilometers wide. No wonder the Zorians did not consider them prisoners. They were not able to hold them. In front of them, in the middle of the platform, a huge pyramid-shaped object was towering over them. The structure was many times larger than any Egyptian pyramid, and its surface was carbon gray, veined with grooves of multicolored light that seemed to form a mysterious energy network. Jake was fortunate enough to be only a few meters from the building and could not help but think that it looked oddly like a spaceship. The style of the light network reminded him somewhat of the blue light-veined spherical ship that had distributed the Oracle devices on Earth. The models were different in terms of materials, shape, size, and color. However, the feeling of unfathomably advanced technology was the same. It was not a technology that humans or even Zorians could master. Speaking of Zorians, there were thousands of them. They too had been randomly teleported to the platform. With only 187 participants on the platform, the players were clearly outnumbered. Moreover, the Zorians had already started to regroup into factions. The good news, however, was that none of these giant thralls had been teleported with them. They were either trapped inside the temple below them or on the plain outside. A barely visible force field appeared to have shrouded the platform and prevented the thralls from rejoining their masters. Jake also realized with frustration that he had wasted his time trying to determine the landing point of the Phantom Sanctuary. He had spotted the scrawny silhouette of Tim, Lily, and the two Zewids a few hundred meters away from him. The children and the two alien bears did not seem to understand where they were, and there was no doubt that they had been teleported here without being asked. Their watchful eyes were constantly scanning their surroundings as they all joined hands to give each other some courage. Not immediately finding Will and Enya, who may have been on the other side of the Phantom Sanctuary, Jake directed his attention to the wall of the pyramid in front of him. Very quickly, while walking along the wall for a few meters, Jake discovered an unevenness that could very well mark the presence of a door. The Zorians of Harmony next to him had no intention of messing with him and had also started to crowd around these uneven areas. With a bit of elbowing, Jake managed to make his way through the Zorian crowd, and he eventually saw the exact shape outlined by these irregularities. It was indeed a door, except that there was no handle or lock set. Without a thin rectangular groove measuring 3 meters by 2 meters, he may not have been able to draw the slightest conclusion. Instead of a lock or a futuristic authentication system, there were 3 half-sphere-shaped holes about 20 centimeters in diameter positioned about 50 centimeters apart each to form the three vertices of an equilateral triangle. These three hollows were connected to each other by a deep groove that reminded Jake of those under the sacrificial altar of the Chaos tribe. He wondered if he had to sacrifice his bracelet to enter or something similar. But in one of the three slots, he recognized the symbol of the soul spell that he had learned under the volcano. Maybe. Jake's face lit up when he thought of a possibility. Indeed, he hadn't tried anything yet. That a Harmony Zorian tore the green soul stone around his neck to everyone's surprise and placed it in one of the three half-sphere-shaped receptacles. Easy. A humming sound similar to an insect buzzing came from the slot, and the cavity quickly decreased in size to fit the dimensions of the inserted stone. An intense green light then exploded from the emerald stone, and this light infiltrated the grooves connected to the other empty receptacles until it formed a triangle of green light. After an initial success, Jake observed the Zorians gathered around similar doors and saw them insert their soul stones into the empty spherical slots, hoping to break through the locking mechanism. Jake was apprehensive at first, but when he realized that all those Harmony Zorians had only green soul stones, he calmed down. Instead, a mocking smile covered his face. As he searched for Will, Inya, and the others to tell them about his plan, the artificial voice resonated in their minds again. Once again, congratulations to all the participants for surviving until then. You have been teleported to the center of the island, to the landing platform of the Tribe of Harmony, where the Phantom Sanctuary has just landed. Hearing this summary, the majority of the participants showed no change of expression, but a few like Tim and Lily were appalled. You may have noticed rectangular irregularities bordering three spherical slots on the inside, forming a triangle. As the most perceptive among you have probably already understood, these are doors. There are exactly 100 of them. Jake already suspected this, but by mentally evaluating the distance between two doors, he concluded that this was accurate. 33 doors per side of the pyramid, which was 99 with three sides. One of the three sides had to have one more door. To unlock those doors, you will have to insert the appropriate combination of soul stones into the three slots. 10 of them can be opened with 3 Naquat stones, 10 with Flintium stones, and 10 more with Orxanium stones. The remaining 70 doors need 1 stone of each type to be unlocked. A soul stone can be replaced by executing the corresponding soul spell. Most of the participants and Zorians seemed to know what these soul stones were, but a few again showed nervous expressions and sweated profusely like baccalaureate students passing a test on a subject they hadn't studied. Some aliens especially, like Werching, were far too dumb to care about such complex things. For such participants, the adventure would probably end here. As if the artificial voice had taken pity on them, a mental image of the various soul stones briefly materialized in their minds before fading away. On the other hand, anyone who had soul stones on them was instantly marked by a color corresponding to the stones on them. Right now, Jake's body was wrapped in a beautiful red light. Seeing this, he chuckled bitterly as he peeked at the 100 or so red soul stones he had stashed in his armor. Perhaps out of instinct, but also because he was immune with his ultraviolet radiance. He had taken quite a few of them off the vault ceiling of the Zorian cave before leaving the volcano. Just like the liquid alloy, he was convinced that it could be sold at a good price in the mirror universe. His plan was to wrap them in a layer of liquid alloy that he couldn't digest, then swallow them all with the intention of making himself vomit once back on B842. He did not know if such a plan would work, but he intended to carry it through to the end. As for those who were ignorant until then of the importance of these soul stones, their attitude changed drastically, and the look they had on the Zorians around them suddenly became more hostile. A few players who thought they were smarter had already planned to use these Zorians to their advantage by letting them unlock the doors for them. But again, the artificial voice seemed to have foreseen this kind of devious trickery. For those who think they can enter with impunity through a door already opened by someone else, give up that idea. As soon as a door is unlocked, the person who inserted the last stone will immediately be teleported inside if that person is the only person in contact with the door at that time. If more than one person is in contact with the door, the last stone cannot be inserted. Once the 100 doors are unlocked, the Phantom Sanctuary will take off again, and the ordeal will end automatically for the unfortunate losers. The other victorious participants will continue their fourth trial inside. In 2 hours, No matter how many doors remain to be unlocked, the Phantom Sanctuary will also take off. May the odds be ever in your favor.